Intruder from the garage. It was just another long, dull day at school, but as I walked home, the excitement of Friday lightened my mood. No school tomorrow. I could finally relax. As I approached my house, I noticed something odd. The garage door was wide open, and the light inside was still on. My dad had left earlier that day for a business trip, so he must have been in a hurry and forgot to close it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I stepped into the garage, turned off the light, and pulled the door shut. The quiet of the house greeted me as I stepped inside, and the thought of having the entire place to myself made me feel free. My mom had gone to a friend's house for the evening, so I was all set for a night of gaming and movies. Hours passed as I got lost in my game. The house was silent, except for the occasional sounds from the TV. I decided to grab a drink, and as I walked into the kitchen, something caught my attention. The garage light was on again. I froze, a strange, eerie feeling creeping over me. Did I forget to turn it off? Or had my mom come back? But I didn't hear her come in. My heart began to race as I approached the garage door, my steps growing heavier. The moment I stepped into the garage, I saw that every drawer in my dad's workshop area was open. His tools were scattered across the floor, as if someone had been frantically searching for something. But no one was there. I hurried back inside, locking the garage door behind me. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I started heading back to the living room, planning to watch TV and try to calm myself down. Then, from behind me, I heard the garage door handle rattling violently. I froze, staring at the door, watching it shake harder and harder, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, as I realized I needed to get out of the house. In my panic, I didn't notice that the noise had suddenly stopped. The silence was eerie, too silent. I ran straight for the front door, my only thought being to escape. But as I entered the living room, I froze in my tracks. Someone was there, a large man, his back turned to me. In his hand, he gripped an axe tightly. It must have been taken from my dad's workshop. I held my breath, terrified that he would turn around and see me. The TV was still playing, masking my footsteps, and I knew this was my only chance. Going upstairs was not an option. I quietly turned back and headed for the back door, trying to stay calm. Once outside, I didn't stop running. I hurried across to my neighbor's house. Panicked, I banged on their door until they let me in. I waited there, staring at my house from across the street, praying the intruder wouldn't come looking for me. I pounded on my neighbor's door, and it felt like hours before Mr. Thompson finally opened it, his face etched with confusion. I told him everything that had happened. Mr. Thompson, a retired firefighter with a strong sense of duty, grabbed a flashlight and an old baseball bat. He assured me he would check the house and that everything would be fine. Reluctantly, I stayed behind, watching him cross the street. My body was still shaking with fear. My anxiety grew as I watched, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. I had called the police. They were on their way, but the thought of that man in my house, wielding my dad's axe, haunted me. I watched as Mr. Thompson cautiously approached the front door, shining his flashlight across the windows and garage. He disappeared inside. I strained to listen for anything, but everything was eerily silent. Suddenly, I saw him step outside. From across the street, his voice echoed faintly. "There's no one in there. The house is empty." A wave of relief washed over me, but I knew I still needed to stay cautious. As Mr. Thompson began walking back toward me, that gnawing sense of unease returned. Before I could voice my concern, a shadow moved behind him. My blood ran cold. The intruder. He was there, emerging from the dark side of the house, the axe glinting faintly under the porch light. I screamed, trying to warn Mr. Thompson, but it was too late. As he turned, the man lunged at him. A fierce struggle broke out. Mr. Thompson swung the baseball bat, but the intruder was strong. The two grappled, the axe coming dangerously close to Mr. Thompson's head as they stumbled across the lawn. My legs wouldn't move, paralyzed with fear, as I watched the horrifying scene unfold. Each second felt like a nightmare. Mr. Thompson managed a strong swing with the bat, striking the man's ribs, but it wasn't enough. The intruder roared in pain, but instead of retreating, he raised the axe, ready to strike. Just as the axe came down, Mr. Thompson threw himself to the side, narrowly dodging the blow. In that brief moment of distraction, Mr. Thompson delivered another blow, knocking the man off balance. I finally decided to rush forward to help, but before I could reach them, the sound of police sirens echoed in the air. He looked up at the sound of the sirens and, using his last ounce of strength, bolted toward the backyard. Mr. Thompson staggered to his feet, gasping for air but still steady. The police arrived just in time, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they chased after the man. Within minutes, they subdued him. The man thrashed violently, growling like a wild animal, but the police swiftly restrained him, pinning him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. I stood there, trembling, watching the entire scene unfold. Mr. Thompson approached me, clutching his side where he had been hit, but still managing a smile. "It's safe now," he said. I felt an overwhelming gratitude for being saved. I recounted every detail I could remember to the police, but all I wanted was to forget. I sat down on the steps of Mr. Thompson's porch, my body trembling, watching the man sitting in the back of the police car as it drove away. It was over, but the image of the intruder's face, his crazed eyes, and the sound of the axe slicing through the air would haunt me forever. Mr. Thompson sat next to me, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing, kid," he said softly. "It's over now." But deep down, I knew the fear would stay with me. I would never forget how close I came to being caught in the grip of something truly evil. The neighbor's dark secret. I often have insomnia, so I often choose to stand at the balcony door, looking out at the quiet neighborhood. I live in a really isolated neighborhood. The houses around here are not right next to each other, although I do have a neighbor who has a fence that I can see over if I stand on the balcony. I'm not being nosy or anything, but that night, I was looking into his yard. I've never met him because that neighbor just moved in, but I assume he lives alone because there's only one black truck parked in his yard. Today, I continued to go to the balcony and look at his yard. The truck had been missing for a week. I played the game of observing the truck at night and theorizing about its purpose, even though that was none of my business. Suddenly, one day, I saw him. My neighbor walked out of the house, dragging something. It looks like it's a long, black bag. It looked quite heavy, and it took him a lot of strength to pull it. On the ground, there is a leak of something that looks thick. He struggled to lift it, then pulled it toward the truck, sliding the side door open. He stuffed the bag into the trunk before driving away, then glanced around as if checking to make sure no one was watching. I stood there, my mind spinning. I couldn't ignore it anymore. So I called the police. They arrived quickly and checked around his property. I stayed, watching from the window as they spoke to him, but then his demeanor was completely different. He led the police to one of his bags, opened it, and inside was meat. He started pointing at his dog, which barked eagerly as he lifted it, filled with excitement. The screams, he claimed, were just him rehearsing a scene from his favorite TV show, and he did it every night. The police found nothing else. To protect my identity, the police came inside and spoke privately about me calling them. They warned me. They said if I continued calling without evidence, I could be charged with privacy violation and harassment. When they left, my neighbor came over, placing a hand on my shoulder. With a friendly smile, he said, "Let's not let little misunderstandings get out of hand, all right?" It felt like a warning. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he really was just an odd guy, with strange habits. Every night, I hear faint, muffled, haunting screams. I tell myself it's just him rehearsing, as he said. Then one evening, he showed up at my door holding a cake. He told me it was his birthday and gave me the cake to clear up any unnecessary misunderstandings between us. Was he smiling? I wasn't sure if it was my mind playing tricks, but I felt like he was giving a sinister smile behind my back, waiting for something. As I closed the door, a wave of fear came over me. I took the cake into the kitchen. I placed the cake on the table, not daring to eat it, and just stared at it for a while. I considered eating it, dismissing my paranoia, and slowly brought it to my mouth. But then, something like an instinct told me not to. I put it down, reminding myself to stay alert. Thinking of him preparing it, watching me, knowing I'd eat it. It was truly horrifying. I grabbed the cake, took it to the trash bin behind the house, and threw it away. I didn't care if I was being unreasonable. I'd rather be safe than sorry. Early the next morning, when I went out to take out the trash behind the house, something caught my eye. There, beside the trash bin, was a small mouse, dead. Its tiny body lay still, right next to where I had thrown the cake the night before. A thin trail of cake crumbs led from the cake to the mouse. The mouse had eaten the cake and died. His depravity was beyond imagining. The cake was not a gift. It was a warning. From that moment, I started watching. Every sound, every strange occurrence, every word from my neighbor. Now I knew he wasn't just a harmless eccentric. He was hiding something dark. Everything started again when I walked past my neighbor's house. My steps slowed as I glanced at his front door, catching sight of a hand pressed against the glass, moving frantically. The glass was old and foggy. I saw someone inside, exhaling and writing help on the dust-covered window. For a second, I turned away, rushing back home. I didn't want to know what was happening behind that door. Back in bed, I couldn't sleep. The image of that pleading face, the desperate scrawl on the window, kept replaying in my mind. The sounds, the black bag, the screams. If I reported this to the police, I knew he'd find a way to cover it up, like he always did. Without evidence, everything would be pointless. I needed a clear and specific plan. I decided to reach out to my friend. I met my friend at the local cafe and explained everything, detailing the strange events and horrific scenes. He looked at me, skeptical, but didn't dismiss it right away. We had known each other for so long, neither of us wanted to believe this was happening. Then he suggested gathering photo and video evidence using advanced technology to avoid detection. I had to do whatever it took to prove my words. Neither of us could imagine what we were about to do next. But I promised him that we would only collect evidence and leave quickly and discreetly. The next morning, I put on a plumber's uniform and a fake mustache, mentally preparing for my decision. I approached my neighbor's door, disguised as a plumber. He opened it, eyeing me strangely, scrutinizing. He glanced at my house, then back at me, asking, "Nick, is that you?" I froze for a moment. I began faking my voice, using a different tone to deceive him, explaining I was sent to check and fix the city's main water pipes. At first, he seemed suspicious and told me to wait a moment before closing the door. I stood outside, not knowing what he was doing inside, waiting and adjusting my glasses. But eventually, he acted friendly and allowed me inside. As I entered, The house was much tidier than I had expected, and nothing suggested he was a murderer. As I pretended to inspect the pipes under his kitchen sink, he stayed close, following me throughout the house. My every move was under his watch. I hadn't anticipated this. His presence was a constant reminder that one wrong move could be my last. I racked my brain for a way to separate myself from him. Then, an idea struck. I asked him to let me check the pipes in the basement, explaining that I needed to inspect the pipes there, adding, "If you come with me, you'll need to be careful. A broken pipe could be very dangerous and make things worse." He hesitated, but finally, he allowed me to go down to the basement alone. I watched his shadow disappear into the darkness. I turned my attention to the house, moving quietly, looking through every corner, hoping to find something out of place. And then I saw it, an edge jutting out along a wall, as if something was being hidden. My fingers brushed along the edge, feeling the rough texture beneath my hand. With a gentle push, the panel creaked open, releasing a foul stench that made me nauseous. I hesitated. Well, would I pro? The smell was nearly unbearable, but curiosity overpowered my fear. I cautiously stepped closer, peering inside. There, in the dim light, I saw a long streak on the floor leading to black bundles that were oozing blood. Then I saw dozens of bodies, skeletal remains intertwined with decomposing corpses. Just as I was about to turn and escape, a cold hand gripped my shoulder. "Hello, my neighbor," a familiar voice whispered in my ear, full of malice. I felt the pressure of his grip tightening, but before I could react, he shoved me forward, standing in front of the door, blocking my only exit. His eyes showed satisfaction. I reached for my phone and pressed the emergency alarm button, just as my friend and I had planned beforehand. He quickly snatched the phone from my hand. Then there was a crackling sound as he crushed it underfoot. I realized I was truly trapped. The police stormed into the house unexpectedly. My friend, true to his word, had taken action when he received my emergency signal. He had told me beforehand that he would alert a trusted officer in case anything happened. The neighbor began to flee, but during the pursuit, he couldn't escape our plan. He was caught and couldn't deny the overwhelming evidence. When I handed over all the footage and he was taken into custody, I lay in the hospital thinking about what I'd been through. I had come closer to death than I ever imagined. I regretted nothing. Killer in the rain. It's late spring in a rural area with vast stretches of wilderness. My small house stands alone in the vast darkness, surrounded by trees, the type of isolation I always dreamed of before moving here. Here, I can live away from the noise, people, and stress of the city. But tonight, the silence feels different. Heavy rain has been pouring for days. I should have found this isolation peaceful, but tonight, it feels suffocating. I'm sitting on an old couch watching TV and listening to the rain pounding on the roof, a soothing sound that usually makes evenings pass peacefully. I enjoy staying home on rainy weekends like this, far away from the world. Around 6 or 7 in the evening, I suddenly heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. Another knock, this time louder. I hesitated. Visitors were rare here. It was strange for someone to show up without calling first. Grabbing a flashlight, I walked toward the door, my heart already starting to race. When I opened the door, heavy rain poured down, and the damp cold hit my face. Standing in the pouring rain was a man, soaked and shivering. He wasn't anyone I knew, just a stranger. He told me he was camping in the nearby woods and had run into trouble. He needed a place to stay, just for the night. His voice was pleading, but something about him made me uneasy. I handed him my phone to call for help, so he could get a ride to town, as I didn't feel safe. But he refused, insisting he only needed shelter for the night. I felt uncomfortable, the rain pouring down on both of us. His insistence made me even more suspicious. I bluntly told him he couldn't stay here. After pausing for a moment, he turned and walked down the dirt path leading back to the woods. I watched him disappear into the trees, his figure fading into the rain. I locked the door immediately, still feeling uneasy. I tried to shake off the strange encounter, telling myself I did the right thing. There was no way to know if he was dangerous, especially in such a remote place. The rain kept falling, and I sat back down on the couch, trying to focus on the TV. But my mind kept drifting back to that knock at the door. After 2 hours, I noticed something, a faint orange light shining through the curtains at the back of the house. I haven't checked the window in a while, but now there's something outside. I stood up and pulled the curtain aside. Through the rain and mist, I saw it far off in the woods behind my house, a small flickering campfire beneath a tree. Despite the heavy rain, the fire was still burning. There was a figure in the rain, but I couldn't make it out. That uneasy feeling turned into fear. Could it be him again? Why had he returned? And what was he doing out there, just standing near my house in the pouring rain? I picked up the phone and called the police. I didn't care if it took them an hour to get here. I needed someone to ensure he was gone. After the call, I glanced out the window again. The fire was still burning, but the figure had vanished. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the front window and saw him, the man from earlier, walking by with a rifle slung over his shoulder. He was heading toward the house, toward me. I staggered toward the closet in the hallway, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handgun and rubber bullets. I had bought it for protection, but I never really thought I would need it. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the man pounding on the front door. This time it was harder, as if he was hitting it with the butt of his rifle. I had to do something. I couldn't let him in. I yelled that I had a gun and I called the police. I stood still, gun in hand, straining to hear any sign of movement. Moments stretched on, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, I looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I cautiously stepped outside, gun still in hand, immediately drenched by the rain. I saw large footprints, caked in mud. He was probably gone, at least for now. About an hour later, the police arrived and searched the area with flashlights. When they got to the campfire, they found something I hadn't expected. A rough canvas bag, half buried in the mud, covered in wet earth. They dug it up and opened it. Inside, they found knives, zip ties, gloves, and rope. They told me it was likely a burglary kit, or worse. I never saw him again after that night. The police haven't found him yet, but they told me to be careful, to stay vigilant. Whoever he was, he had plans to come back, maybe even to kill me. Killer in the rain. It's been half a year since that night. The memory of that encounter still haunts me. I thought time would ease the anxiety, that the man would fade from my mind just like he disappeared in the rain. But as the months passed, the fear grew more intense. What if he came back? Tonight, as the sun set, the rain returned, pouring heavily, just like that day. I was sitting in my usual spot on the sofa, watching TV despite my efforts. My attention wasn't on the screen. I kept glancing at the window all evening, unable to shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching me. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The sound cut through the rain, and my heart skipped a beat. Could it be happening again? I cautiously opened the door, but this time I was prepared, my hand resting on the pistol I had placed in the nearby drawer, ready for a moment like this. The porch was empty, except for the relentless sound of rain hitting the ground. But just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something. Footprints. Someone had been here, fresh and muddy, still sticking to the porch. I went back inside and locked the door. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining that I thought it was the same man who had tried to harm me years ago, and he was back. They said they'd send someone, but I had no idea how long it would take. For now, I was on my own. The rain continued, growing heavier by the minute, the wind picking up as well. I paced the living room, glancing out the window every so often. That's when I saw a flash of light deep in the woods. I realized I couldn't wait for the police to arrive. I had to confront him before he made his move. Panic welled up inside me, but this time, I reminded myself not to lose my composure. I grabbed a flashlight and my pistol, threw on a jacket, and headed out the back door. The rain drenched me the moment I stepped outside. I followed the flickering light deep into the woods. My flashlight cut slowly through the night as the muddy ground made every step feel heavy, not just from the mud, but from my hesitation to venture further. I continued on. As I ventured deeper, my steps became slower and more cautious. Then I crouched behind a tree to get a better look. It was him, unmistakable with the scar on his face. He was there, standing by the fire, his back to me. And in his hand was something different this time, not a rifle, but an axe. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain sizzled on the fire. I didn't know what he was doing, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself as if planning something. Suddenly, he stopped and turned toward my house. My house. He started walking, a strange smile spreading across his face. At first, he walked slowly, but then his pace quickened, the axe swinging in his hand as if he were preparing for a bloody hunt. He approached the house. I didn't have time to think he only had an axe after all. I pulled out my pistol and stepped out from behind the tree, shouting for him to stop, but he didn't stop. He kept walking, eyes fixed on my house, as if I weren't even there. I fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp sound cut through the rain and thunder. He stopped. For a moment, everything was still, as if the world itself held its breath. Then he turned to face me, cold, empty eyes and that twisted, horrifying smile. He raised the axe above his head. Before I could react, he charged. I fired twice. One shot missed, but the other hit his leg. He staggered, like a zombie, but still got up, the axe still raised. I shot again, this time hitting him in the shoulder. He dropped the axe, collapsing to the ground with a pained scream, unable to bear it anymore. Rain poured down on both of us, the fire flickering wildly in the wind. I stood over him, the gun still aimed, my hands trembling, uncontrollably. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police were coming. They surrounded the man, disarmed him, and pulled him to his feet. He glared at me as they dragged him away, his eyes filled with hatred. I returned to my house, locking the door behind me, and collapsed onto the sofa. The rain continued outside, but it no longer felt suffocating. For the first time in a long while, I finally felt truly safe. The deadly farewell. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as I walked through the sterile hallway of the hospital. I had worked here for years, the smell of antiseptic and the beeping of monitors ingrained in my senses. But lately, something felt different, something that always sent a chill down my spine. My patients came in all ages, but there was one little girl named Tira, perhaps the youngest patient in the hospital. Tira was a sweet child. She often wandered the halls and talked to other patients, though she was mostly alone. One night, while working a night shift, I was doing my rounds as usual. In the empty, long corridor, I heard two people talking softly. It was late, and all patients were supposed to be asleep. I followed the sound, which was coming from room 203. As I carefully opened the door to check, I saw her. Tira was standing near the patient's bed, smiling at me mysteriously and greeting me. But my sudden appearance didn't startle her at all. I reminded her that it was past bedtime and asked what she was doing there. She replied,
"Nothing. I just came to say goodbye to George."
George was the patient in room 203. He had recently undergone major surgery. Though Tira seemed calm to me, I noticed George's face. He looked terrified and extremely pale. When I turned to remind her and take Tira back to her room, she had vanished as quickly as if she'd never been there. The next day, I went home around 4 a.m. after my night shift ended. It was my day off, so I slept the entire day. When I returned to work and walked past room 203, I thought about checking on George. But when I opened the door, I found a different patient, and I was informed that George had passed away the previous day. I stood frozen in the hallway, suddenly remembering when I asked Tira what she was doing in George's room. She said she came to say goodbye. But why goodbye? Shouldn't it have been good night? Something was very strange. Every time I encountered little Tira, I would find her wandering the empty hallways at night, talking to someone or entering a room. At first, I was skeptical, but I noticed that her presence seemed to coincide with the moments just before a patient passed away. Could she possess the strange ability to know when someone was about to die? Then I searched the hospital records. Tira wasn't listed anywhere. There was no information about her being admitted, and no legal guardianship papers on file. I was stunned. I gradually became obsessed with Tira's story and started investigating her background. My suspicions grew when I learned from a nurse that Tira had died in the hospital just a few months ago after falling down the stairs. However, the nurse insisted the incident was ruled an accident, and the hospital never made it public. My mind reeled. How could Tira still be here if she was dead? I started piecing things together, and a chilling thought struck me. Perhaps Tira's spirit was still lingering here. One day, when I dozed off at my desk, I saw her. She was sitting, crying in my dream. I slowly approached Tira. Tira turned to face me, her pale face and empty eyes brimming with a profound sadness. She said,
"I've been waiting for you, Dr. Cooper. You're the only one who can help me."
I stood frozen, the air thick with fear, or perhaps confusion. I asked Tira, "Help you? Tell me how." Tira's ghost stepped closer, her small hand reaching toward me. She whispered painfully,
The experiment killed me."
I jolted awake at my desk, drenched in sweat from what I had seen. It was too real, like a cry for help. I knew I needed to act. I dug through old records, my hands trembling. I found it, just a copy, a part of a plan I'd never seen before. It all seemed to point to a dark secret. The deeper I delved into Tira's past, the more I realized her death was no accident. In reality, it was the result of an illegal medical experiment involving an unapproved drug to test the limits of human pain endurance and survival. Tira was selected as a test subject due to the influence of her adoptive father, a man working at the hospital as part of an underground network of unethical experiments. The drug used on Tira was untested and had horrifying side effects. Tira's death was the culmination of a cover-up to protect the hospital's reputation. One night, while working the night shift at the hospital, I heard strange noises, like a child crying, coming from the abandoned wing of the hospital. The sounds led me down a hallway that hadn't been used in years. My heart pounded as I pushed open a door, revealing a forgotten room. Tira stood there, her figure faint in the dim light. her eyes filled with sadness and pain. She told me that she couldn't leave and that she had been trapped in the hospital ever since her death. Her spirit was tethered to the hospital, bound to the hallways, unable to move on until the truth about her death was revealed. Tira had guided other souls to the afterlife, but she herself was trapped here. When I made my final efforts to reveal the truth, the hospital management and the girl's adoptive father tried to discredit me, even going to great lengths to silence me by threatening my career. The hallways were empty, the hospital eerily silent. I walked through them, knowing they were trying to stop me. But I didn't falter, and I was determined to report everything to the authorities, ensuring that those responsible would be held accountable. As the authorities investigated, I stood in a patient's room, moonlight streaming through the window. I saw the silhouette of a little girl standing behind me. It was Tira, appearing now in a more peaceful form. She smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. She thanked me, her voice gentle, as her figure began to fade away. Tira's departure finally brought clarity. The hospital faced public outrage, and the administration was forced to shut down. Her adoptive father was arrested for his involvement in the illegal experiments, and justice was served. Although Tira's ghost was gone, the darkness of the hospital remained, reminding me that the line between life and death, between justice and illegality, is often much thinner than we imagine. The last ride. I had been driving for Uber for about 6 months, mostly at night. The pay wasn't great, but the quiet streets and dark city made it tolerable. People always had their own stories to tell, and most rides were uneventful. Drunk passengers, late-night partygoers, or quiet workers returning home. But one night changed everything. It was a Friday, a little past 1:00 a.m. I was sitting in my car, parked near the downtown area, waiting for my next fare. The streets were mostly empty, a light mist hanging in the air. My phone pinged with a new ride request. The pickup was in an isolated area on the outskirts of town, where the streetlights were few and far between. I hesitated for a moment, but accepted the ride. As I drove through the quiet streets, the mist thickened into a fog, making it harder to see more than a few feet ahead. The GPS directed me down a narrow, winding road, surrounded by trees on both sides. I glanced at my phone. Destination, a spot marked only as unknown road. The location seemed remote, almost too remote, but I shrugged it off. People lived in weird places all the time. When I pulled up to the pickup location, there was no house, just a dirt path leading into the woods. I waited, glancing nervously at the trees, their branches looming overhead like skeletal fingers. My phone chimed again, a message from the rider. "I'll be right out." I watched the darkness, waiting for someone to emerge, but minutes passed and no one appeared. Just as I was about to cancel the ride, I saw movement. A figure stepped out from the fog, walking slowly toward the car. My headlights illuminated a tall man, wearing a long, dark coat. His face was hidden in the shadows, but something about him felt off. He opened the back door and slid into the seat without a word. "Where to?" I asked, trying to mask the unease creeping into my voice. The man didn't respond right away. After a long pause, he said in a low, raspy voice,
"Just drive."
Every instinct in my body screamed at me to cancel the ride and get out of there, but I didn't want to make a scene. I started the car and pulled away from the curb, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He was staring out the window, his face still obscured by the shadows of the back seat. As I drove, the fog thickened, making it hard to see the road ahead. The man remained silent, his presence heavy and unsettling. Every now and then I'd glance in the mirror, and he'd just be sitting there, motionless. The tension in the car was suffocating. After a few minutes, I broke the silence. "So, where exactly are we going?" The man slowly turned his head to face me. His eyes met mine in the mirror, and I felt a chill run down my spine.
We're going home.
He whispered. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. Who's home? He leaned forward, his face now partially visible in the dim light of the dashboard. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were hollow, empty.
Yours.
He said, his voice barely above a whisper. A wave of terror washed over me. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My heart raced as I turned to confront him, but the back seat was empty. The door was still locked, and the fog outside pressed against the windows like a living thing. I sat there, frozen, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I checked the mirror again. Nothing. I turned in my seat, but the back seat was completely empty. The man was gone. Shaking, I grabbed my phone and checked the ride. The request had vanished, as if it had never existed. There was no record of the trip, no rider profile, nothing. I sped away from the spot, the fog swallowing the road behind me. When I got home, I locked every door and window, my hands trembling as I did so. I don't know what I encountered, but the image of the man's sunken eyes and his cold words echoed in my mind and seemed impossible to forget. I never drove for Uber again after that night, and every time I pass by that isolated road, I feel a cold dread settle in my chest. Somewhere out there, the man in the dark coat is still waiting for his next ride. The strange man in the snow. Last winter, I went to a small cabin owned by my uncle in Mountain Valley. I finally reached the cabin after a long 3-hour drive, the tires crunching on the frozen ground. Stepping out of the car, the cold bit through my coat. Almost immediately, a boy around 15 or 16 years old ran out of the cabin. He was young and smiling. His eyes looked tired, as though he hadn't slept in days. He took my luggage and guided me inside. I stepped inside the cabin. It was simple and rustic. A fireplace stood in the corner, with wood neatly stacked beside it. The boy explained how cold it got at night, his voice unusually calm. I told the boy I would go skiing and asked if he could prepare dinner for me while I was out. He nodded with that strange smile. I dressed in my ski gear, excited to hit the slopes. I began skiing through the forest, where all the trees were bare. Halfway down, snow started falling, thick and fast. I took a break and walked toward a large tree. Suddenly, a faint growl echoed in the air. I froze. Standing next to the tree was a man looking up at the sky, his face covered in falling snowflakes. His neck was unnaturally long, and his shoulders jutted out at odd angles. He didn't move at all. This man was unsettling. I quietly stepped back, avoiding sudden movements so as not to disturb him. I just wanted to get back to the cabin. I stepped cautiously, but accidentally crushed a twig underfoot. A loud snap broke the silence. The man looked down, his eyes glowing like those of a wild animal. Blood was smeared across his mouth, and his right hand clutched a dead rabbit, its belly torn open. The man wiped his mouth with his other hand and smiled wickedly. Panicked and frantic, I bolted through the forest, snow crunching under my boots. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following. I burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind me. I quickly locked it. The teenager noticed something was wrong. He came out of the kitchen, and I shouted to call the police immediately. He calmly replied, "There's no service here, sir." I checked my phone, and he was right. There was no signal. "What's going on, sir?" the boy asked. I realized I couldn't tell the boy the truth about the man. I didn't want to scare him. So I lied and said I had heard wild animals in the forest. After a while, I calmed down, embarrassed by my overreaction. Perhaps I had exaggerated it too much. While having dinner, the lights suddenly went out. A heavy snowstorm had started outside, and I could hear the windows rattling from the fierce wind. I wondered where the boy was and realized I never knew his name. Suddenly, I heard footsteps crunching on the snow outside. I slowly turned my head toward the large window. Near the fireplace, the light illuminated a bloodied hand pressed against the outside of the living room window. His bloodied hand was pressed against the glass. It was the man I had seen in the forest. His face was pressed against it, smearing blood across the surface as he grinned, staring directly at me. The man's mouth gaped open, his tongue licking blood around his lips. His unblinking eyes were fixed on me. Then the boy walked in, as if he had been hiding, and looked at the man through the glass. He wasn't scared. He was almost amused. His smile mirrored the man's grin. "That's my father," he said. I froze for a moment, then grabbed the car keys off the wall. I flung open the front door and ran barefoot into the storm. I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from the cabin. The boy's laughter followed me into the night. I hurried to the car, driving for 2 hours, barely able to see through the snowstorm. I didn't stop until I reached the next hotel. Once I was safe, I called my uncle. His answer sent chills down my spine. What boy? There's no caretaker at the cabin. No one else is supposed to be there. Horrified, I realized I had spent hours in that cabin with complete strangers. The next morning, I reported it to the police. They went with me to the cabin. It was empty. My belongings were gone, and the cabin was spotless, as if no one had ever been there. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what those people wanted, but I would never stay in an isolated cabin again. The haunting of the abandoned station. It was a chilly autumn evening in our small town. Inside the diner, warmth enveloped me. Sarah, my girlfriend, was finishing her cup of coffee. We had been dating for a few months, and tonight seemed like the perfect opportunity for an adventure since we both enjoyed that. After dinner, we decided to explore the old abandoned train station in town. The train station loomed before us. Built in the early 1900s, it had once been the heart of our town, but now it lay in ruins, overtaken by nature. My heart raced, but I didn't want to show fear in front of Sarah. I reassured her, even though I felt a hint of doubt creeping in. She began glancing around nervously and told me she felt something was off. Then, from afar, we heard a faint whistle echoing through the air. Sarah asked me, "There are no trains running here anymore, right?" I only knew that no trains had run here for decades. The whistle grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of wheels clattering on metal tracks. Sarah tightened her grip on my arm. "We need to go right now," she urged, panic rising in her voice. But somehow I lost control, as if mesmerized by the sound, stepping closer to the edge of the platform, staring down the empty tracks. The sound grew louder, yet no train was in sight, just the tracks stretching infinitely into the darkness. Then, as if summoned from nowhere, a blinding beam of light appeared, racing toward us. It approached quickly, gliding down the tracks like a ghost, but something was off. That light wasn't attached to any train. It hovered. Sarah screamed, urging me to stop, pulling me back just as the invisible train roared past. Its force nearly knocked us over, the platform shaking violently. For a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the station was silent again, the air heavy and still. Distant sounds returned, but something had changed. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," I called, panic rising within me. I searched for her frantically. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing on the tracks, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, its eyes glowing red like embers in the dark. A chill ran down my spine as it raised its hand, pointing down the tracks. Far down the tracks, I saw Sarah, walking away from me. But she wasn't walking normally. Her movements were stiff, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Sarah, stop!" I yelled, but my voice echoed back, swallowed by the night. I ran toward her, desperation driving each of my steps. The closer I got, the more horrific reality became. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes vacant and soulless. It was as if her very soul had been drained. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for her, but the distance between us never closed. The shadowy figure at the station let out a raspy laugh, echoing through the trees, sending waves of fear crashing over me. I turned to face the figure, but it had vanished. In its place stood an old, rusted, decaying train, its windows shattered. Shadowy figures filled the cars, their hollow eyes staring at me. The door creaked open, like an invitation into the darkness. My heart raced with fear and curiosity. A whisper brushed my ear. "Join us. We've always been here waiting for you." I shook my head, backing away, but the pull of the train was too strong. My legs moved on their own, drawing me toward the door. Just as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. The train swayed, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see Sarah sitting across from me, her eyes vacant. "What's happening?" I choked out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed out the window. I looked outside. I was standing on the platform, staring at the train. But how could this be? I was inside. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The train raced faster and faster, the outside world fading into a blur in whispers. Suddenly, it stopped, and the door creaked open. Then, that dark figure appeared inside the train, leaning in close, its cold breath chilling me to the bone. "You should never have come here," it whispered, and everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, the train and station gone. All that remained was an empty field overgrown with weeds, a stark contrast to the horror I had just endured. I stood up, dazed and disoriented, and headed back to town. As I neared the town square, something caught my eye, a missing person poster. It was Sarah's face, but the date was from 10 years ago. My heart sank as I stumbled back, trying to comprehend the horror. Had I really been gone for 10 years? Or had Sarah vanished long before I ever met her? The truth was too horrific to grasp. Desperate for answers, I rushed back to the station, but when I arrived, it was gone. Only an empty field remained. The train, the darkness, the station all vanished as if they had never existed. Memories flooded back the faces of victims, broken families, the whispers of those who had vanished without a trace. Each shadow symbolized a haunting reminder of what I had escaped, of the guilt I carried for failing to protect those who needed me most. I turned away and walked on, ready to embrace the memories instead of fleeing from them. The shadows may linger, but I would no longer let them control my life. The haunting of invisible ghosts. His name was Henry, and he always enjoyed taking late-night walks. There was something about the stillness that made everything feel simpler. It had been this way for years, a nightly routine for him and his dog, Boss. Henry had been a welder for over 40 years. Now, he was living alone on this large farm. The house, too big for just one person, had felt empty ever since Maria, his wife, passed away. Henry's children had moved out long ago, and after cancer took his wife's life, it was just Henry, left alone with the memories. Tonight, after a long day, Henry decided to take a walk. The cool night air was refreshing, and his dog Boss trotted beside him, his nose sniffing the ground as if searching for something. As Henry made the loop around the house, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement in the second-story window. The bedroom window, the one that belonged to Maria. Henry stopped. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow, something or someone moving inside. Henry's heart raced, not believing his eyes. He hadn't set foot in that room for years, let alone let anyone else in. Henry stared up at the window, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him, but something wasn't right. Without hesitation, he rushed inside, Boss close behind, and stormed up the stairs 2 at a time. When Henry reached the bedroom, the door creaked open slowly. The room was empty, exactly as he had left it. Henry's eyes scanned the space, nothing out of place, no signs of anyone being there. Henry felt foolish for overreacting, but that unease, that creeping sensation, stayed with him. Something had been there, Henry was sure of it. The next night, Boss's low growl woke Henry from a deep sleep. He sat up, listening, straining to hear over the pounding in his ears. That's when he heard the creaking of floorboards. Henry's first instinct was to grab his rifle, and he moved into the hallway, raising the gun. A dark figure stood at the end of the hall. A woman, her face obscured by shadows, her hand stretched toward him, fingers unnaturally long. Another night passed. Henry came downstairs early in the morning, only to find the kitchen lights on. He remembered turning them off. Henry grew tense and started calling the police. They searched the entire house, even bringing in the K-9 unit, but nothing turned up. Henry could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe him, but he knew something was wrong. That was the last straw. The next night, Henry went back upstairs. He didn't know what compelled him to return, but when he opened the door, the sight nearly stopped his heart. Maria's clothes, which Henry had packed away after she died, were scattered across the floor. It was as if someone had pulled them out. Panic rose in his throat. Henry staggered back, and that's when he saw her. A figure stood in the doorway, a woman, but it wasn't Maria. Henry couldn't make out her face, but she was shorter, thinner, someone he didn't recognize, and her presence filled him with dread. Before he could react, she ran, disappearing down the stairs and into the night. Henry chased her to the front yard, but she was gone by the time he made it outside. Bosley and Henry searched the property, but there was no trace of her. Henry didn't sleep that night. In fact, he hadn't slept in days. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside it all felt like her, lurking, waiting to return. Henry kept his rifle close, afraid he might actually have to use it. A few weeks later, it happened again. Henry was sitting in the living room, trying to distract himself with the television when he saw her. She was standing in the yard, staring at Henry through the window, just a shadow, silhouetted by the moonlight. Henry grabbed his rifle, his hands trembling, and ran outside, firing warning shots into the air. She turned and ran into the darkness, disappearing once again. The shots had probably scared her off for now, but deep down, he knew this wasn't over. The next day, after Henry had been out for errands and returned home late, he didn't see Boss greet him. He searched every corner of the house, but everything felt empty. But Henry still had one last room to check, Maria's room. He stumbled into the bedroom, the door creaking open. Maria's clothes were no longer scattered across the floor. They were neatly hung. But what Henry dreaded had come to pass. The woman was still there, sitting on the bed, staring at him. Her eyes gleamed, and she smiled a cold, twisted smile. She whispered that she had been waiting for him. Henry froze, shocked. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. That voice, it was Maria's. But something was wrong. It was cold, hollow. Before Henry could react, her face shifted from an indistinct blur to something grotesque, her skin melting into a monstrous form. The skin peeled away, revealing rotting flesh underneath. Her eyes sank into her skull, her mouth gaping in a horrifying grimace. Henry screamed and raised his rifle, but it was too late. She lunged at him, and as darkness engulfed him, her fingers seemed to scratch and penetrate his chest. The haunting of invisible ghosts. Henry slowly woke up with a strange feeling, something rough rubbing against his face. It took a moment for Henry to open his eyes and realize it was Boss licking his face. Henry remembered the last time he couldn't find his dog, but after everything that happened, seeing Boss made him feel more at ease. Henry groaned, his whole body aching as he struggled to sit up. Everything felt too stiff, the joints rigid, and the muscles dull with pain, as if she had actually lunged at him, clawing and piercing into his flesh. Boss whimpered softly, his gaze fixed on the bedroom door. Henry glanced over and saw nothing unusual, but he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something strange was inside his own home. Days passed in a vague exhaustion. Every night, it was the same. Boss sat in front of the bedroom door, staring, ears pricked up as if waiting for something. Then, like clockwork, at that exact hour, he would start barking, the sound echoing throughout the house, jolting Henry from his restless sleep. He would get up, gun in hand, and search the house, but he never found anything. The house remained silent, the darkness unchanged. He tried to convince himself that it was just Boss being protective, or perhaps reacting to something normal outside. One night, the barking started again, more intense than ever. He jumped up, hurried down the stairs, gun at the ready, and froze at the sight before him. There, near the living room window, Mari was standing. Her face was gentle, hair flowing in the wind. Henry was paralyzed, an uncontrollable feeling swelling within him. Henry hadn't seen her in years. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of comfort. Boss fell silent, his barking turning into a faint whimper, as if something wasn't quite right ahead. He slowly approached the window, but then something changed. Henry stepped back as Mari's gentle form began to fade, her features distorting, as if cracking horribly, her joints twisting grotesquely, unnaturally. Her eyes seemed to darken, sinking into her face. Her mouth stretched into a wide grin, revealing sharp teeth, with black slime oozing through the cracks in her face. He suddenly realized she had come, perhaps deceiving him and appearing in the form of Mari's spirit. He knew that couldn't be his wife. The figure by the window vanished, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. Henry rushed outside, desperately searching for her, or it, whatever he had just seen. He circled the house, calling for Mari, as if somehow she might still be there, but there was no one. As Henry turned the corner of the barn, he suddenly felt an icy chill. The world around him seemed to shift. The night grew unnaturally dark. It felt like the darkness was swallowing the farm. He heard a whisper, soft and mocking.
Henry.
It was her voice, but distorted and broken, drawing him toward the barn. Henry pushed open the barn door, and there she was again, Mari standing motionless. The whispers grew louder around him.
Come home, Henry. It's time.
The voice echoed from every direction. The darkness closed in, pulling him to his knees as if hypnotized to obey. Her form began to twist again, skin peeling away, revealing a skeletal grin beneath. The barn door slammed shut behind Henry with a piercing noise, swallowing the faint light of the moon. The air filled with voices chanting Henry's name, full of malice. He stumbled back, desperate to escape, but the ground beneath him gave way, sending him plunging into a deep, cold pit. He landed hard on a damp surface. Henry reeled from the overwhelming stench of decay, and as he looked around, rotting corpses, with sunken eyes, stared back at him. He tried to climb out, but the walls of the pit were slick. The bodies began to move, their skeletal hands reaching out, grabbing Henry's legs, pulling him down. A grotesque figure emerged from the darkness above. It was her again, a monstrous version of Mari. Limbs elongated, her smile impossibly wide, filled with jagged, blackened teeth.
Henry.
It's time to join us,
she said. Then suddenly, Henry found himself in Mari's old room. The figure leaned closer, its icy breath brushing against his skin.
You can't escape, Henry.
He felt an unnatural pressure tightening around his neck, and he couldn't move. As his vision darkened, it was slowly taking control of him. The first light of dawn crept over the farm. The house lay still and cold, its windows dark and empty. Boss lingered on the porch, his mournful howl echoing across the silent fields. No one knew what really happened. Henry was gone, or perhaps he was still there, but no longer himself. The Curse of the Doll. The sun was setting as Claw walked home alone. Suddenly, an elderly woman appeared, dressed in tattered clothes, approaching her. The woman approached Clara, extending her hand which held an old, creepy-looking doll. What was strange was that the doll's head was tilted at an odd, unnatural angle, with a deep crack running down its body. At first, Clara intended to walk past, but something compelled her to stop. She gave the woman a few coins, and the doll was pressed into her hands before the woman left immediately. Clara returned to her apartment, the doll in her hands. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but dismissed it as just the chill of the night air. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she was completely unaware of the faint, soft footsteps following her. Claw held the doll up. Its lifeless eyes stared blankly, as if looking right through her. An uneasy feeling washed over her as she grasped its broken body and placed it on a high shelf before turning away. That night, Claw lay in bed. She tried to sleep, slowly turning onto her side. And right there, beside her pillow, was the doll, its broken neck tilted to one side. Its eyes stared hauntingly at her. She snatched it up and tossed it aside. The next morning, before heading to work, Claw paid little mind to it. She picked it up, glanced at it for a moment, then temporarily set the doll on the sofa. However, when she returned that evening, she found the doll in an odd position. Unexplainably, it was sitting on her bed in her bedroom, even though Claw had closed the door beforehand. She was certain she had left it in the living room. Claw furrowed her brow, glancing around her apartment, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. But soon after, she began to notice that her doll seemed to be moving around the room. In the following days, these occurrences seemed to persist. She began to see sticky notes scattered throughout their apartment, with phrases like "hello" and "it's broken." These notes were written on leather paper, something they didn't even have in the house. One afternoon, while alone in the apartment, Claw heard a faint rustling sound, as if someone was moving inside. She froze, straining to listen. After a moment, she began searching the rooms but found no one. However, on the bedroom floor, she saw the doll lying face down, its neck broken at an odd angle. A sharp pain shot through her chest, and she glanced at her hand, horrified to see bloodied scratches. The streaks of blood ran down her palm, though she had no idea how they got there. She stared at the doll, feeling as though its lifeless eyes were mocking her. What she couldn't understand was that within 2 days, the scratches vanished as if they had never existed. That night, Clara lay in bed, nervous. She tried to close her eyes, but a faint whisper echoed throughout the room, growing louder and louder until she could clearly hear the words, "It's over." Suddenly, a pressure bore down on her, and her eyes flew open to find the doll just centimeters from her face. Its eyes locked onto hers. Claw gasped for breath. She sat up, but the doll had vanished. It remained on the shelf as if it had never moved. Days passed, and Claw became increasingly withdrawn, her face pale, eyes dim. The presence of the doll seemed to grow, draining her energy. In a final frenzy, Claw found a metal bin in a nearby alley and threw the doll into the fire. The fabric doll burned, and Clara looked away, believing it was all over, and went home. But when she returned, the doll, singed but seemingly unharmed, sat inexplicably in her room. She felt powerless and exhausted. She picked it up. Suddenly, she collapsed to the floor, a strange sensation washing over Clara, as if her soul was being pulled from her body, drained by the doll. The next morning, an old woman stood in an alley. In her hands, she tightly clutched the tilted doll. People passed by, avoiding looking, instinctively feeling uneasy before her presence. Then there was a girl whose expression was more curious than scared. Her eyes stared at the doll, a curious excitement flashing in her gaze. She walked over and held out the doll. "You seem to like it, don't you?" She held out her hand, almost reaching for it before she pushed it away like she always did. She was excited to have it. Letting go, she watched contentedly as her new victim clutched the doll, seemingly unaware of the curse. She was welcoming. As the young girl turned away, the old woman's eyes followed her. That's right. She was born to do this. The ghostly tome. An old library stood at the edge of town, a structure with stone walls darkened by centuries of weather. Ivy covered the walls, and narrow arched windows allowed only the faintest. This was where Clara worked as the head librarian, a job she had cherished for over a decade. She always found solace in the silence, the smell of old books. But something had changed. Clara arrived early and approached the heavy wooden door. As she unlocked it, a shiver came over her, a feeling she had been experiencing more often lately. She took it as the cold of the morning and went inside. The library was still and silent, as usual at this hour. Clara moved through the familiar aisles, her footsteps echoing softly. She followed her routine, checking book returns and organizing new arrivals. The building's silence was comforting, yet today it felt oppressive, almost watchful. She made her way to the basement, where the rare and old books were stored. It was her favorite part of the library, but for some reason, they were often not taken out for reading. The basement was the coldest part of the library, and as Clara descended the creaky wooden stairs, she felt a growing sense of unease. The basement was dimly lit, the only light coming from a few flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Shadows danced across the walls, and the musty smell of old paper was stronger here. She was searching for a book that a researcher had requested from her library. As she searched, she heard a faint rustling sound behind her. She quickly turned around, but saw nothing. She told herself it was just a rat. Clara continued her search. Finally, she found the book she was looking for, an old leather-bound tome with faded gold lettering. As she pulled it from the shelf, she felt a sudden, icy breeze brush past her. The lights flickered, and she heard the rustling again, louder this time, as if something was moving through the stacks. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched the book to her chest. She decided it was time to leave the basement. As she turned to go, she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A shadow, darker than the others, passed between the bookshelves. She stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. A shadow that had the vague shape of a human being. The shadow stopped, forming a vaguely human-like shape that seemed to be looking straight at her, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. She stumbled up the stairs, nearly dropping the book in her haste. Panic struck. Clara struggled to find the flashlight, but her hands were shaking so much that she couldn't turn it on. The rustling sound grew louder, closer, until she felt it right next to her. Clara felt something cold and wet touch her arm, and she screamed. At that moment, she dropped the book, revealing pages filled with strange, unfamiliar symbols. reluctantly took the book back, feeling an inexplicable pull to take it with me. In the darkness, as she brought the book upstairs, Clara could feel its presence. It seemed to seep into her mind, filling her with fear. As she neared the basement door slammed shut behind her with a deafening noise. The library above seemed unchanged, still and silent, but the claustrophobic feeling remained. Back in the main lobby, Clara sat at her desk, a mysterious book in front of her. She placed the book on the table and took a breath, then stared at it with both fear and curiosity. She started to wonder whether she should open it or not, but then she curiously opened it to examine the symbols, flipping through each page, brittle with age. The symbols seemed to shift and change, almost as if they were alive. She shook her head, blaming her imagination. And thinking she was being paranoid. Darkness filled the library. She suddenly read a passage out loud. Suddenly, the whispering became louder. The lights flickered violently, then went out completely. Clara's breathing became rapid. She tried to ignore it, closed the book immediately, and decided to put it back in its place. The library was silent and dark. Clara, she doesn't know if she's in her imagination, or if something is residing in this library, or if there are hidden secrets that she doesn't know yet. Morning light cast long shadows through narrow windows. Clara stood outside, hesitating to enter. She gathered her courage, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. Clara slowly walked toward her desk, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. As she passed by, she glimpsed the old book she had stored in the basement yesterday lying on her desk. Clara was horrified. She was certain she'd put it back on the shelf in the basement. Clara stared at the book, hesitated for a moment, then grabbed it, deciding to destroy it in hopes of freeing herself from this fear. She walked toward the old fireplace at the far end of the library, gripping the book tightly. She opened it, and the symbols writhed as if alive, almost resisting her. She threw the book into the flames. A hissing sound escaped from the book. The fire abruptly went out, extinguished, leaving the book charred but still intact. Clara stared at the ancient book, desperate. She raised the book to throw it into the trash. But as she swung her arm, an invisible force pulled it from her hand. The book flew across the room, hovering mid-air. Then it started flying back, hurtling toward her with fierce speed. It slammed into her chest, knocking the wind out of her in pain. She gasped, stumbling backward, clutching her aching ribs. She held her breath, watching the book fall to the floor, its pages flapping wildly. Clara's hands trembled as she picked up the book again, and from the corner of her eye, she sensed someone standing and watching her. At that moment, everything seemed to go dark. Turning slowly, she found herself face to face with a shadowy figure from her nightmares. She lifted her phone flashlight to see. The figure moved slowly into the faint light, revealing the distorted, grotesque shape of a woman. Her skin was pale, stretched tightly over sharp, angular bones. Her face was gaunt, with only skeletal features. Her mouth twisted into a crooked smile, revealing jagged, decayed teeth. Her eyes were black, hollow, and lifeless. Clara stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her hand. The grotesque woman moved closer, her jerky movements almost puppet-like. Then, in the blink of an eye, it lunged toward her, its twisted, skeletal hand stretching out, distorting as it reached for her. Its claw-like fingers scratched across Clara's face, as if devouring a meal. Clara raised the book defensively, trying to fend it off, but the spirit lunged at her again. With its unnaturally elongated arm, it grabbed her shoulder once again, pulling her closer. Pain tore through her, as if her skin was being ripped apart. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The woman's face came closer, her distorted smile stretching impossibly wide, revealing layers of rotting flesh inside her mouth. She stared into the ghost's endless, empty black eyes. The book slipped from her hand. The book's pages began to flip wildly, symbols blazing with dark energy, as if absorbing the terror flooding the room. In a final attempt to escape, Clara crawled backward, away from it, but it floated after her, laughing loudly, piercingly. Clara's vision dimmed as her strength drained away, her body paralyzed, her mind succumbing to the encroaching darkness. The library stood eerily silent, pale light cast on the dark stone walls. Villagers gathered, whispering to each other as they noticed Clara's absence. The library doors remained shut, and though a few dared to peer through the windows, they saw only empty, silent rooms with no sign of Clara. The whispers lingered, awaiting the next unfortunate soul to uncover the library's secrets. Ghost in the Gym. A violent storm raged outside, the rain pattering against the windows of the gym. Today, Nana arrived earlier than usual to prepare for the upcoming exam, hurrying toward the gym. Her gym teacher greeted each student outside the girls' locker room. As usual, Nana entered the locker room, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly due to the storm. She walked to her locker and took out her workout clothes. As she began preparing her things, a faint shadow caught her eye, gliding along the other side of the lockers. She paused, glancing around. Curiosity overcame her, and she called out, "Is anyone there?" Nana walked toward the source of the noise, which was at the end of the locker room, where a row of shower stalls stood, the last stall covered by a thick, dark curtain. Nana approached, the lights beginning to flicker erratically. Not knowing where she found the courage, she reached out and pulled back the closed curtain, revealing only an empty shower stall. She was about to turn away when she sensed someone passing right behind her. She froze for a moment, then a sound like soft sobbing echoed back, sending chills down her spine. The temperature suddenly dropped, a chill enveloping her. At that moment, the voices of other girls echoed in from the hallway. Nana temporarily felt relieved as she stepped out of the shower area and saw a group of students walking by. She asked if they heard someone crying, but the girls exchanged puzzled glances and shook their heads. She returned to the gym class, where everyone was gathered. Suddenly, a terrified scream echoed throughout the gym. A fellow student named Lee ran in, her face pale and filled with fear. She collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. The gym class fell silent as everyone stared in horror, confused and frightened. As the teacher pressed Lee to explain, she trembled, describing a horrifying scene she told of a baby, covered in blood, appearing in the bathroom and standing there crying. After class, Nana decided to stay behind for extra practice. She walked alone to the entrance when she suddenly noticed a key lying on the floor and the gym door ajar. A dark sense of unease washed over her as Nana stepped into the dimly lit room. She tried to turn on the lights, but they seemed to be out of order. Determined to push past her fear, Nana decided to prepare for the upcoming swimming exam. She walked to the pool area, the dim lights reflecting off the water. As she approached the pool, she heard a nearby sobbing voice, that of a girl, weak and sorrowful. Nana stopped, looking around the area, but saw no one, and everything fell silent. The overhead lights flickered, distorting her vision for a moment. As she squinted, she saw a shadow floating at the far end of the pool. Her first thought was that it was a student practicing diving, as that occasionally happened. But as time passed, she realized that the shadow wasn't moving. A sense of unease welled up inside her, and she decided to check, just to be sure. Nana approached the edge of the pool, her eyes fixed on the floating shadow. As she got closer, fear surged within her. The water around the shadow began to darken, turning a deep crimson, and she realized with horror that a lifeless body was floating in the pool. Overcome with fear, Nana ran to seek help. Moments later, the police arrived to investigate. They confirmed that the body belonged to a student who had been seen alive just a day before. Nana suddenly realized it was Lee. Her mind was haunted by memories of her friend. She learned that her friend had been haunted by strange visions, driven mad by sounds and sights that no one else could perceive. Lee could not stand the pressure from many sides. It caused her to develop depression and pushed her to the brink. Nana stood at the school gate, watching the flickering lights of police cars fade into the distance. The storm had passed, but a chilling emptiness lingered in the air. She shuddered, haunted by thoughts of the ghostly figure and the cries she had heard. In the following days, Nana lay in bed, tossing and turning as she recalled haunting images. The pale face of her friend Lee, the bloodied child, and the dark water lingered ominously in her mind. In her sleep, the voices of Lee echoed in her ears, pleading, desperate, and faint. With each passing day, they grew louder, resonating in her mind. The next morning, Nana walked through the school hallway, the world around her feeling dreamlike. She paused in front of the gym, staring at the closed doors before walking away. That night, Nana fell asleep. As she closed her eyes, she was pulled into another nightmare. She stood in the gym, surrounded by darkness. Lee's face appeared before her, eyes wide with fear as she reached out, as if wanting to say something. Then everything seemed to change. The water in the pool turned red, and she watched in horror as Lee emerged from beneath the surface, slowly rising as if trapped. Nana tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The next day, Nana's nightmare still haunted her thoughts. Each day was filled with a nagging feeling that she was overlooking something urgent, something dark that only she could confront. She knew she needed to understand what had happened to Lee to help her find peace. Nana dove into research, sifting through old-school records, searching for any information about unexplained incidents at the gym or pool. After hours of digging, she stumbled upon a small article about a tragic incident, the unsolved death of a young girl at the school many years ago. The report detailed how a female student mysteriously drowned in the pool, and witnesses claimed to have seen a crying child nearby, although no child was ever found. Through the faded articles and forgotten records, she discovered that a child had been abandoned at the school. The child had died under tragic circumstances, perhaps explaining why the girl's spirit wandered, trapped here. The more she read, the more Nana understood the connection. The spirit of the abandoned child, full of pain and loneliness, had latched onto isolated students. Lee had been haunted by this spirit, drawn in by her own sorrow. That night, Nana returned to the pool one last time, determined to confront the spirit and free her friend. The water's surface was unusually still, almost holding its breath. A figure slowly emerged from the darkness, the ghostly form of a child, her wet hair hanging in tangled strands around her pale, hollow face. The child's eyes were dark and empty, locking onto Nana with a sharp, calculating gaze, as if probing her intentions. Nana opened her mouth to speak, her voice trembling, but the child moved closer. Suddenly, the child's face twisted, her mouth stretching into a cruel smile. She reached out with her bony, skeletal hand, extending sharp fingers towards Nana like claws. Nana stepped back, fear rising in her stomach, but she held her ground. She could only follow her heart, her voice trembling as she said, Please, I want to help you. To the child's spirit, the child's smile faded, her expression stiffening, as if she had heard these words before, words that ended in betrayal. The child's empty eyes narrowed, and she lunged forward, her hands clawing at Nana's throat. Nana stumbled back, but she stood her ground, raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. I don't want to hurt you. I understand your pain. The child paused, her arms falling to her sides, confusion evident on her face. But then her expression twisted again, suspicion flickering across her features, as if she were battling memories of her own pain and betrayal. In desperation, Nana moved closer, her hand shaking but steady as she extended it. The child hesitated, her appearance wavering between anger and sadness, her expression softening as Nana's words seemed to touch something deep inside. For the first time, the child's expression softened into one of almost peacefulness, her anger dissipating as she released her grip, her form fading into a gentle light. After all, there was one more thing Nana had to do. In her dream, she remembered something that Lee had conveyed to her. Nana recalled being led by Lee to a forgotten corner of the locker room, where an old art portfolio lay hidden beneath a pile of sports equipment, covered in dust. When she was alive, whenever under pressure, Lee would paint vibrant children's paintings, cheerful expressions, and serene landscapes. Each painting was filled with warmth, completely contrasting the darkness that enveloped Lee in her final days. The following weekend, Nana went to the local orphanage, clutching the portfolio to her chest. She handed it to the director of the orphanage, explaining Lee's wishes. As she had promised, Nana had painted and written about their story to memorialize them, ensuring that no one would forget them. Nana returns to school. She reflects on her journey. The remaining echoes of the past have faded, replaced by a feeling of fulfillment. She has somehow helped bring peace to suffering souls. Stranger in the dark. My family was excited about the trip to my aunt's house. I had always looked forward to spending time with my cousin Luca, my closest companion. We arrived at my aunt's house, surrounded by towering trees. Luca rushed outside, her face lighting up when she saw us. After a while, we headed to the nearby store, eager to grab snacks for movie night. We excitedly filled our hands with treats. As we were about to walk home, a man called out to us. I turned around to see a well-dressed man holding a bag of chips. He smiled warmly, and instinctively, I moved closer. The man handed me the bag of chips, and his friendly demeanor put me at ease. I thanked him and walked away without giving it much thought. Night fell, and the atmosphere in the house changed. We gathered in the living room, surrounded by snacks, as we prepared to watch a movie. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed through the house, sending a shiver down my spine. I exchanged a worried glance with Luca, asking if she had locked the door. She hesitated, unsure, and decided to check. The weight felt unbearable as I stood there. My anxiety grew, and I got up to see why she was taking so long. As I stepped into the hallway, my heart stopped. Luca was lying unconscious on the floor, and a masked man was standing next to her. My breath caught in my throat as panic surged through me. I staggered back, feeling paralyzed with fear. The man noticed me and rushed forward. I turned and ran toward the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind me, locking it just as I heard him pounding on it. I glanced back at the door, the man's pounding echoing in my ears. I couldn't leave Luca behind, even though fear gripped me. Summoning all my courage, I grabbed a plate from the kitchen rack. When the noise outside stopped, I slowly opened the door for a peek. Suddenly, the door burst open, knocking me back. I managed to swing the plate toward him in desperation. It shattered on his head, fragments flying everywhere. Blood streamed from the wound as he staggered back, dazed. I rushed into the kitchen, my hands trembling as I grabbed my phone. I tried to dial for help, but I couldn't press the buttons. I was too shaken, not knowing what to do. I ran to check on Luca. I splashed water on her face, and after a moment she woke up. Confusion replacing her unconscious state. Relief washed over me, but I knew we weren't safe yet. When I heard the man stirring, a cold wave of fear swept over me. I couldn't let him find us. I whispered to Luca that we needed to hide. We crept into the kitchen and hid behind the counter. The door creaked open, and I held my breath. I peeked out and saw him searching for us, his eyes scanning the room with a predator's hunger. Fear suffocated me as I gripped Luca's hand tightly. I heard him coming closer, his footsteps making my stomach churn. The sound stopped, and for a moment, silence blanketed the house. Then the lights flickered, plunging us into darkness. Suddenly, I shuddered as a cold hand gripped my shoulder. I turned around, and it was Luca, her eyes wide with fear. I could barely see the silhouette of the man in the darkness. Instinctively, I crept forward again, pulling Luca toward the back door, where the faint moonlight streamed in. We dashed outside, running frantically toward the trees that surrounded my aunt's property. We heard the man's laughter echoing through the trees, sending chills down my spine. We spotted a narrow path ahead, leading deeper into the woods. We had no other choice. The path opened up to a cliff overlooking a dark abyss. Panic surged inside me. There was nowhere left to run. Luca and I slowly backed away, but the man kept coming closer, his eyes gleaming with malice. I could feel my heart racing as I tried to reason with him, my voice trembling. He lunged at us, and instinctively, I pushed Luca aside. In a desperate attempt, I grabbed a sharp rock from the ground and held it out, ready to defend us. The man laughed, unfazed by my feeble weapon. He lunged again, but this time I dodged to the side. In the chaos, the man stumbled, losing his balance at the edge of the cliff. Time seemed to slow as I watched him teeter on the brink, his expression shifting from confidence to panic. He flailed, reaching out into the air. With one last gasp, he slipped and fell off the cliff, his scream fading into the night. Luca and I stood frozen, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding. We looked at each other, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Finally, we followed the path back home. We rushed back home, locking the door behind us. I collapsed onto the chair, trembling, while Luca sat next to me, her eyes wide in disbelief. I realized the gravity of everything and decided to call the police about the horrifying events. I felt grateful because just a little more, and we could have lost everything. The shadow of an eccentric person. Maggie had been staying at her friend's apartment in this remote town for the past few weeks. The old apartment was the perfect escape for her from the chaos of life, but the peace she sought was quickly overshadowed by an odd, unsettling feeling that seemed to linger in the walls. Lily moved around the living room, tidying up a bit. She noticed there were quite a few mirrors hanging on the walls, as her friend was a collector of mirrors. But those mirrors gave her an inescapable feeling that they held something more. As she passed by one of the mirrors, for a brief moment, she felt as though something, or someone, was staring at her. She wasn't sure and brushed it off. Maybe it was just her imagination. She picked up a few scattered items from the coffee table and walked down the hallway to the bathroom. That night, Lily prepared to take a bath. She was tired and wanted to relax, to forget the strange feeling creeping into her thoughts. She turned on the faucet to fill the bathtub, steam filling the room. But as she was waiting for the tub to fill, her eyes suddenly caught sight of the mirror above the sink. She felt as if something was moving. Maggie startled, turning around, but there was no one in the room. The air was heavy with silence. A shiver ran down her spine, and she quickly exited the bathroom, her thoughts spinning. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing, just stress from being alone in a strange place. One night, as she was about to drift off to sleep, she noticed a noise, or something moving. A shadow was cast on the floor. She felt an unease unlike anything she'd ever experienced. She didn't dare move. Her anxiety grew. Suddenly, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Maggie turned, opened her eyes, and there he was, a tall, pale, gaunt man with sunken eyes standing right behind her. Maggie jumped up, rushed to turn on the bedside lamp, but her hand slipped, and she knocked it over. As the lights flickered, the room lit up intermittently, but she couldn't see anyone. Then everything didn't stop. Shortly after, she heard a soft tapping on the window behind her. Maggie hesitated, then gathered her courage and opened the curtain, but there was no one there. She panicked. It felt like a staged prank, as though something terrible was happening. She tried once again to shake it off and left the bedroom, but she didn't realize a man had appeared, standing silently, staring at her. He didn't move, just stared at her with eerie stillness. Days passed, and she began losing track of time, her mental state deteriorating. The reflection of the man started appearing more often, sometimes standing motionless at the end of the hallway. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow at the end of the hallway. For the first time, he physically appeared, a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes, dressed in filthy, tattered clothes. Fear consumed her as she backed into the corner of the room. He was slowly approaching, his face twisted into a sinister grin. In horror, he lunged at her. Maggie was shoved into the large mirror, shattering it into a cacophony of sharp, piercing noise. As she fought back, the man screamed,
You will be mine.
He gripped her wrists tightly, but in the chaos, he momentarily lost focus, distracted by his own delusions. Desperate to free herself, Maggie grabbed a shard of broken glass and, with all her strength, stabbed his hand. He howled in pain and released her. Maggie seized the moment of his distraction to escape. She ran out of the apartment, calling for help from anyone nearby. Soon, the police surrounded the apartment, and he was captured. He was an abnormal, deranged individual who had been living in an abandoned house nearby for years. He was arrested and placed in a psychiatric facility after being diagnosed with severe mental instability and a history of violent behavior. The police believed he had been stalking Maggie for weeks before his outburst. Even though he was captured, she couldn't shake the feeling that the mirrors in the house still reflected something strange. The trauma lingered within her, and it would take a long time for her to recover. Mysterious man at the fast food restaurant. I had been working at this 24-hour fast food restaurant for years. Most of my night shifts were quiet. However, tonight was different. The night started like any normal shift, nothing out of the ordinary. Our night cook called in sick, leaving me to manage the whole restaurant alone until someone could assist at 4 a.m. The silence in the restaurant was eerie. With no customers around, I spent time cleaning the kitchen, focusing on scrubbing away the grime. Then, I heard a loud noise coming from the front of the restaurant. There was a man outside the entrance. He was standing there, his face pressed against the glass, peering inside and banging on the door. He didn't seem normal, which made me feel uneasy. The door was locked. I approached the glass, trying to stay calm, and gestured for him to go around to the drive-thru. He didn't respond, just stared. I shouted through the glass that the dining area was closed, but he didn't move, just stood there, lifeless. I turned and went back to the kitchen. I tried to continue working, focusing on my tasks. 15 minutes passed, and I convinced myself that he must have left. But the unease still lingered. A beep went off in my headset. Someone had placed an order. I turned on the mic and asked for their order, but all I got was silence. I checked the camera at the drive-through lane, no car, no sign of anyone. I sighed and turned away, but then I froze. I heard something, footsteps, light, careful steps coming from above, as if someone was walking on the roof. I tracked the noise until it stopped at the ladder leading to the maintenance door in the ceiling. The footsteps halted above. I was sure someone was up there. I quickly searched for a lock or anything to secure the door. I had never used it before, so I wasn't sure if it could even lock. I heard the trapdoor creak. It was slowly beginning to open. A small gap appeared, and through it, I saw a pair of cold, unblinking eyes staring at me. Panic consumed me, and without thinking, I turned and ran toward the front door. I bolted outside to my car, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. Trembling, I called the police and described what was happening. From the safety of my car, I glanced back at the restaurant, my eyes scanning the windows, and then I saw him. A shadow moving near the counter. For a moment, he looked directly at me, then suddenly darted into the kitchen. The police arrived and searched the entire building, inside and out, even checking the roof. But the man had vanished, disappeared as if he had never been there. Nothing was stolen. No money, no equipment, nothing was missing. He had broken in, but he didn't take anything from the restaurant, like a strange stalker. After the police left, I sat in my car, staring at the darkened restaurant. My mind kept replaying the moment I saw him look at me in such a strange and unsettling way. I went back to work. My boss had installed a lock on the ceiling door, a safety measure that should have been done long ago. But my job was never the same. From then on, I startled at every sound, never knowing if he would come back. The girl in the red dress. The house we moved into after my father's death wasn't anything special, just another old, quiet mansion in the suburbs, far removed from our old life. It had been abandoned for a while, and it was clear why the rent was suspiciously cheap. Overgrown grass and neglected old furniture gave it a forgotten feel. But to my mother, it was home. I was 20 years old, and I dealt with my grief in my own way. Not long after we moved in, I began noticing small things slowly emerging in the house. But the sounds of whispers, creaking noises made me uneasy and anxious living there. It started with scratching, soft, persistent, on the other side of my bathroom door. At first, I ignored it, hoping it was just my imagination. But night after night, the sound continued. Then came the knocking, sometimes at the front door, sometimes at the window. It always came around midnight, but no one could possibly be there. We kept the gate locked, and no one could enter the yard. Yet the knocking continued. I told my mother. She dismissed it, saying, "It's just an old house." But I knew the house wasn't just old, it was holding on to something. One night, I invited my friend Joe to stay over. We were sitting in my room talking about school when we heard voices coming from the kitchen. It was well past midnight. Everyone should have been asleep. Out of curiosity, we pressed our ears against the door. A conversation was happening just outside, but we couldn't make out a single word. We tiptoed into the hallway, but the kitchen was empty, dark, cold. We checked the entire house, nothing. Everyone was asleep. The voices were gone, leaving only a chilling silence. A few weeks later, my brother decided to test his luck. He and his friends thought it would be fun to play with a Ouija board in my room while I was away. They thought it was just a silly, superstitious game. At first, nothing happened. They laughed awkwardly, asking questions but receiving no response. Then one of them froze. His face turned pale, his body stiff like a statue. Without a word, he bolted from the room, his friends close behind, terror in their eyes. Once outside, the guy finally spoke. He had seen her, a girl, standing at the bathroom door, wearing a red dress, her hand on the knob, staring at them. He said she couldn't have been older than 13, and her eyes were filled with something he couldn't describe. Fear, anger, curiosity. When my brother told me this, I thought he was just trying to scare me. Of course, I didn't believe him. Why would I? I had never seen her. But the story haunted me, lodged deep in my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. Later, I had a birthday party at a friend's house. Jordan, a friend of mine, got drunk, so I took him to my room and told him to stay there until he sobered up. He collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep. Later, I went to check on him. The room was pitch black, with only a faint light coming from the bathroom. Jordan wasn't in bed. He was sitting at the bathroom door, one leg in, one leg out, talking to no one. I tapped his shoulder. He jumped, then looked at me, confused. He glanced back at the bathroom, then at me again. He mumbled, "I thought I was talking to you, but I just laughed it off, thinking he was too drunk." The next day, he explained, I was teasing him, but he was dead serious. In his drunken state, he had seen a girl in the bathroom. She was wearing a red dress, standing in the middle of the bathroom, asking why he was there. And when I walked in, she disappeared. It didn't stop there. The hauntings, the knocking, the voices continued. My fear grew as one by one. People close to me began talking about an entity that I had never seen in this house. I left my room and went to talk to my mother. While we were on vacation, my aunt and uncle stayed at the house. When we returned, they were sleeping on the living room floor, terror etched across their faces. They said the shower in my room kept turning on by itself, and the radio too, making it impossible for them to stay inside. My mother had no choice but to confront the landlady, who initially denied everything. But the truth came out. The landlady's mother had lived in this house as a teenager with her twin sister, who had ended her life in the bathroom wearing a red dress. It was all true. The red dress, the girl, the spirit trapped within the walls of our home. I didn't know how I was going to convince my mother to leave, but since we were struggling financially, it was piling up, so I had no choice but to stay in the house a little longer. The girl in the red dress. The days that followed were tense, filled with a thick sense of unease that blanketed the house. My mother decided we should move out and find a new place to live. However, things weren't settled yet, and we faced difficulties. So we had to stay in the house a little longer to figure things out. That was our last night in the house. I couldn't sleep. The woman in the red dress kept lingering, haunting my mind. I lay in bed, wrestling with these thoughts until I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see the house one last time. I got out of bed and walked through the dark hallway. I headed to the bathroom, where it all began. As I reached the bathroom, a chill filled the air, heavy with tension. I hesitated at the doorway, feeling something preventing me from turning on the light. I stepped inside, the cold tiles pressing against my feet, and then I felt another presence in the room. Fear gripped me tightly. Her presence was so strong, I could feel her breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare turn around, didn't dare move. As I stood in the darkness of the bathroom, a cold hand rested on my shoulder, and a flood of images of the girl in the red dress filled my mind. It was as if she was showing me her story. Buried for decades, the girl, now known to me as Maria, had lived in this house long ago. She was intelligent and talented, but her life was full of suffering because her twin sister was always more favored for her beauty. Everything about Maria seemed overshadowed by her sister. As the years passed, she felt trapped in her own home, living in her sister's shadow, who seemed to have everything Maria longed for. The breaking point came when her sister fell in love with a man. They planned to marry, with their parents' blessing. But Maria, who had quietly loved the same man, was devastated. Even her own chance at happiness was taken from her. Unable to bear the pain, Maria spent much of her time in the small bathroom. It became her sanctuary, the only place where she could escape the suffocating presence of her sister, and the life she felt was never meant for her. One night, overwhelmed by sorrow and loneliness, she made a tragic decision. She thought that leaving this world would make things better, and she ended her life in that very bathroom. Her sister, consumed by guilt, left the house in grief, but Maria's spirit remained bound to the house, trapped in the place where she had taken her own life. As the images faded, I understood the profound despair of Maria. Her spirit had lingered all these years, waiting for someone to recognize her pain. But now, as I stood there in the bathroom, I felt a strange connection with her. The sorrow that had once filled the room was replaced with an intense urge to help her find peace. I whispered, trembling, calling Maria's name. I told her, "I understand what you've been through. You don't deserve to be so alone. I'll leave, and you don't need to stay here anymore. It's time to let go and find peace." In that moment, the cold hand on my shoulder lifted. The oppressive air slowly began to ease. For the first time since we moved in, it felt as if the house itself had released its hold on her after all this time. That night, I slept in my bed without fear, no knocking, scratching, or voices. Everything had disappeared. Perhaps she had finally left, freeing herself from the chains she had once forged. The next morning, as we packed the last of our belongings into the car, I looked back at the house one last time. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the old, stately mansion. As we drove away, I felt that Maria had found the peace she longed for. The house was just a house now, no longer haunted by the sorrow of the past. And though I know I will never return, I will always remember Maria, the poor girl in the red dress, who finally found the freedom she had been denied in life. Haunting delivery trip. I was working for a food delivery platform on weekends to make some extra money. Between my main job and this side gig, I often felt exhausted. It was past 9 p.m. when I started my shift, picking up small orders and delivering them to random houses. After my first delivery, I drove around the area for a while, waiting for something to come through. 20 minutes passed with nothing. Just as I was about to give up, my phone buzzed with an order for just 1 tacos and a drink. I confirmed the order and headed to the restaurant to pick it up. After grabbing the order, I began the 10-minute drive to the customer's house. It was a normal neighborhood, nothing unusual. As I approached a red light, I noticed a pickup truck stop next to me. Instinctively, I glanced over. The guy in the truck was leaning out of the window, staring straight at my car. I looked away when the light turned green and pressed the gas. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The truck was now in my lane, driving a short distance behind me. As I approached the neighborhood where I was making the delivery, the truck was still behind me. Was he following me? The route was mostly straight, so I wasn't sure if he was just heading in the same direction. I tried to stay calm, but the moment I turned into the neighborhood, I knew. The pickup truck turned in too. Maybe he lived here, I thought. I continued driving through the quiet suburban streets, following the GPS until I reached the final road, a dead end. I braked and parked on the side of the road near the house number I had to deliver to. The truck followed and parked behind me. I sat there, frozen, trying to come up with a plan for the worst-case scenario. What was this guy doing? Was he really following me? I glanced at my phone and saw a message from the customer asking, "When will the food arrive?" Could it be the guy in the truck? Was he the customer waiting for me to step out? I felt more trapped than ever. The man got out of the truck. My heart pounded as I watched him slowly approach my car. He stopped right by my trunk, his face partially hidden in the shadows. Then, out of nowhere, he grabbed something like a metal rod and slammed it into my rear windshield. The glass shattered around me. I screamed and, without thinking, instinctively slammed my foot on the gas. The man jumped onto the back of my car, nearly lying flat as he tried to crawl through the shattered window. I swerved sharply, making a U-turn, and felt him fall off the car. My hands trembled as I maneuvered between the trucks. In the rearview mirror, I saw him stumbling in the street as I sped away. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone to call the police. By the time the police arrived, the man had vanished. All they found were shards of glass scattered across the road. They searched the area, but he was gone. I stood staring at the cracks in my shattered windshield, and memories of the terrifying experience replayed in my mind. I was lucky to have escaped, but deep down I still felt uneasy because he was still out there, haunting delivery trip. It's been almost a month since that horrifying night. I haven't driven for the delivery app since then. Every time I think about driving, the echo of shattering glass floods my mind. I try to tell myself it was just an incident, that I was unlucky. There were no witnesses. The police reassured me they'd find him, saying it was probably just a disturbed person trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be some reason he was following me. I decided to try driving again. I needed the money, and I couldn't let fear control my life. I told myself that this time I'd be careful and avoid driving too late at night, and I'd stay away from isolated neighborhoods. As I got into the car, that familiar fear washed over me. My hands were sweaty. I tried to close my eyes, take a deep breath, and turn the key in the ignition. Things started off fine. I was careful and checked my mirrors more frequently. But as the sun set, my phone buzzed with an order that sent a chill down my spine. 1 taco and a drink. A simple order, just like that night. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the accept button. I figured it was just a coincidence, so I accepted the order. A light drizzle had begun. The drive to Taco felt eerie, as if I was retracing the same steps as that night. I picked up the order and placed it on the passenger seat. As I drove to the delivery address, waves of anxiety hit me. The house was in a different neighborhood, but each turn felt strangely familiar. When I parked at the curb, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The headlights of a car behind me suddenly flicked on. I looked, it was a truck, and it looked just like the one from that night. Panic set in as the truck rolled closer, its blinding headlights on full beam. The truck parked right behind me, as if waiting for me to make a move. I tried to text my customer, but I was shaking so badly I couldn't type properly, wasting precious time. Suddenly, a notification popped up on my phone. Customer, when will my order arrive? I couldn't believe it and dropped my phone right then. It was happening again. Could he have been waiting for this moment to get revenge? I couldn't go through this again. I had to act. I pressed the gas, moving my car to another spot. The truck slowed down behind me, its headlights glaring blindingly in my rearview mirror, causing me to squint. Suddenly, the truck surged forward, crashing into the back of my car. The impact jerked me forward, my chest slamming into the steering wheel. Pain shot through my ribs as I gasped, trying to catch my breath. I pressed the gas harder, but the rain had made the road slick, so I had to maintain control to avoid crashing. Panic hit me as he pulled up alongside, rolled down his window, and gave me a sinister smile. Another slam. The back of my car crumpled, and I felt something wet trickling down my head. My head had been injured and was bleeding from the impact against the window when he rammed me again. I braked hard, dazed, my vision blurring from the blood running down my face and the sharp pain in my side. But I couldn't give up. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 for help. I could see his silhouette through the rain, stepping out of his truck. I refused to give up, flooring the gas and driving blindly. My car slammed into a tree. Desperate to survive, I fumbled for the door handle, trying to get out before he got too close. In the distance, I could hear him screaming angrily. I forced myself to run, sprinting toward the woods at the edge of the road. Suddenly, I tripped. My ankle twisted and sharp pain shot up my leg. I couldn't move. He was almost on top of me, his shadow looming as I tried to crawl toward the edge of the road. I turned to face him. He raised the crowbar high above his head, ready to strike, and I screamed. But then, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet rain. He froze, trying to run, but it was too late. The police used a taser and tackled him to the ground. He was finally caught. I fainted, slowly losing consciousness. Paramedics loaded me into an ambulance, and a wave of relief washed over me. The nightmare was finally over.
Scary story in the hospital. Nana. She is a nurse with experience working with elderly patients at a geriatric hospital. Today is her extra shift, so she is severely sleep deprived. She was assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. The patients in this ward love her very much. Tonight, Nana is attending to some patients, but one of them makes her more uneasy than the others. Her name is Len. Not only that, this is a poorly lit hospital room. The air is thick with the smell of antiseptic, mixed with a faint musty odor that sometimes gives her goosebumps and makes her shiver. This is her first night working with Mrs. Len. Len is a middle-aged woman with messy hair and wide, fearful eyes. Every time she enters the room, Len starts talking about the voices she hears and the man in black in the corner of the room. Another woman in the room had requested the curtain to be drawn before her shift started so Len wouldn't be disturbed. The shift starts around 9 p.m., and most patients are asleep by 11 p.m., but not Len. Whenever she calls her in, she speaks with a trembling voice about the voices she hears. The man in black keeps staring from the corner of the room, which frightens her a bit. She has to reassure herself that it's just the medication. She believes that in Len's mind, she is seeing and hearing these things and feels very empathetic. Just imagining those things is very scary. She tries her best to help Len calm down and sleep. Len calmed down and fell asleep after a while. When most of the patients have fallen asleep, time seems to pass very slowly. The corner of the room appears darker, the shadows thicker, and now it has become suffocatingly silent. 1 or 2 hours later, while Nana was in the equipment room to get some supplies, I heard something in the room. The room was quite small and relatively quiet. Strangely, she had closed the door. She immediately turned around but saw nothing and continued to focus on getting the supplies. She tried to focus, but Len's silent warnings echoed in her mind, creating a sense of unease. A moment later, she suddenly felt a cold chill down her neck, as if a hand touched both of her shoulders. Nana looked down at her shoulders and then screamed loudly, but there was nothing there. She looked around and checked the door. There was no one in the room, but she felt a large presence gripping her shoulders. With no other choice, she had to complete her work. She continued loading items onto the cart until it was full. When the supplies were full, the single light bulb above her flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Nana glanced at a moving shadow reflected on the wall in front of her. She turned around and saw a faint human silhouette reflected in the glass window of the storage room door. The figure was not clear, but its presence was unmistakable. It stood completely still, watching her. Her breath caught, and her hands began to tremble. As she slowly approached, she started screaming loudly and collapsed to the floor, her heart pounding as she saw the man in black standing there, smiling eerily through the glass. The scream was loud enough to wake everyone up. The man disappeared from view through the glass door, and a few seconds later, the door opened, and one of her colleagues helped her up. She immediately asked about the man, but there was no one else there besides the two of them. The scream had awakened Mrs. Len, and when she walked in, Mrs. Len was holding her head, repeatedly talking about the voices, the laughter, and the screaming. Nana asked her what the man in black looked like, if he was smiling strangely. But Mrs. Len just focused, frowned, and looked at the corner of the room, terrified. She then said,
"How do you know?"
And Nana began to feel scared, her heart racing, thinking it might be true. Mrs. Len started screaming to be taken out of there and urged to be removed quickly before he arrived. The other nurses came in and tried to help her calm down. That night, due to unstable mental health and overwhelming fear, every creak and groan of the old building startled her. Her nerves were tense and painful, but she vowed to protect her patients from any darkness lurking in the shadows. Determined to find the source of this evil presence, Nana, with a sense of medical duty, returned once more, summoning all her courage as she descended the creaking basement stairs, the air growing colder with each step. She found herself in a forgotten basement room, filled with dusty old medical equipment and shelves lined with ancient books. In the center stood an old mirror covered in a thick layer of grime. Nana approached the mirror, feeling a powerful, oppressive energy emanating from it. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared in the reflection, clearer and more terrifying than ever. Realizing the figure was bound to the mirror, Nana frantically searched the room and found a ritual doll on one of the shelves. An inscription indicated it could be used to banish the spirit. Gathering all her courage, Nana placed the doll down and recited a prayer she had learned as a child, hoping to expel the evil presence. The shadows wavered, and the figure seemed to weaken. But it wasn't enough. The figure screamed in rage as she pressed the cross and the doll against the mirror. The glass shattered with a piercing sound, and the figure disintegrated. The room began to warm, the oppressive feeling dissipating. Everything gradually felt lighter. Everything was strangely quiet and peaceful. A few days later, Len improved and was discharged from the hospital. Nana continued her work with a new purpose, always vigilant for potential encounters with the otherworldly. This was also a testament to the power of courage and the triumph of light over darkness.
Screaming in the crematorium. I work at the morgue in the crematorium area. It's not exactly the most glamorous job, but it helps me pay the bills, and that's what's important to me. Plus, I don't exactly hate working there. I've never been the most sociable person, so at least I don't have to deal with many people. Technically, my job isn't much different from filing paperwork in an office job. The tasks involve checking tags on bodies to ensure everything is in its rightful place, placing a body in, cleaning one of the machines for another body, and collecting the ashes. I have to admit, though, that sometimes this job can be a bit more gruesome than office work, especially when dealing with a severely decomposed body or a dismembered cadaver from a medical case. But I've gotten used to things like the smell of burning flesh, human ashes on my clothes, and so on. It was one of those days when I was working alone. We had 5 bodies to cremate and 3 machines. I had placed 2 of the bodies in the machines and was waiting for them to finish. It would take about 2 hours to cremate one body. Bodies can make sounds when they're burning. Sometimes it's moans or hissing noises. These are just the sounds of gases escaping from the body, a pretty unsettling part of the decomposition process that no one really talks about. But I've mostly learned to tune those sounds out. I had just checked the ID on the body I had placed into the machine, a tiny old woman who had arrived the day before. Her name was Hylis. She had died from a fall and had a horridly long gash on her head. She was definitely dead when I placed her on the conveyor belt. My attention was on the body I had just put in, and as I listened, I could hear it, the faint, indistinct sound of a weak scream. I had never heard a dead body scream before. I thought it was just the air escaping or something like that, so I shrugged it off and went back to preparing the next body. But then I heard a knocking from inside one of the machines. I froze for a moment, and my heart began to race. I turned back to Hylis's machine. She had been burning for nearly an hour. Her body should have been nothing more than charred bones. Yet, I could see movement, hear the banging. The screaming started again, this time louder. My hands trembled as I tried to make sense of what was happening. But the banging grew more intense, and the scream turned into a desperate, raspy voice, choking out the words, I stepped back, starting to feel uneasy as something banged against the door again, causing it to warp. But I could swear that the body had moved. Then, the door of the machine buckled. Flames burst out from the sides, and smoke filled the room. The door flew open, and I saw a shadow move through the flames. I held my breath as I realized this was no joke. I stumbled backward, seeing charred, skeletal hands emerge from the door of the machine. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, sprinting toward the door, not stopping until I was out on the street. The smoke alarms were blaring as I reached the door, and the sprinkler system had activated. Sirens wailed in the distance as firefighters arrived on the scene, and they managed to extinguish the flames. The crematorium was reduced to a charred skeleton. The next day, the news reported a mysterious fire at the crematorium, destroying most of the building. The cause remains unknown, and her remains are believed to have been lost in the fire.
The curse of the top students. The school stood tall and intimidating with its Gothic architecture, old and worn, with ivy creeping up the walls. The atmosphere always felt gloomy. The walls were adorned with old portraits of past headmasters and notable students, their eyes seemingly following anyone who passed by. The floor creaked with every step. Elena, a studious girl in her late teens, was seated at a desk near the back of the classroom, immersed in a book. The room was empty except for her, and the silence was suffocating. The school had a bookshelf dedicated to the history and legends of the school over the years. It was quite large and sparked her curiosity to learn more. Elena searched through the archives, looking for information about a mysterious curse she had heard rumors about. While reading an old history book about the school's founding, she came across a leather-bound book, aged and ancient. Unexpectedly, A page with a paper bookmark revealed a section about the curse of the good and top students at the school. Years ago, the school had been plagued by a series of unexplained events. The top students began disappearing under mysterious circumstances, their academic excellence seemingly attracting a dark force. Shadows moved on their own, and strange whispers filled the hallways. Elena read about how the curse started with a student who made a pact with an unknown entity to achieve academic success. The price was their soul, and the curse had haunted the school ever since. Elena left school to go home. She started to feel scared because she was one of the top students at the school. She hadn't witnessed anything herself, so everything seemed vague to her, caught between reality and fiction. As she descended the stairs, the eyes of the portrait seemed to follow her, glowing faintly and eerily in the light. Elena entered the bathroom to splash water on her face, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. She looked up into the mirror and saw a shadowy figure standing behind her. She spun around, but the bathroom was empty. Her breathing became rapid, and she quickly left. Elena sought refuge in the science lab, hoping to find a logical explanation for the strange events. As she flipped through a textbook, the lights flickered and went out. She heard a low growl and saw beakers and test tubes rattling on their own. A cold breeze brushed past her, sending shivers down her spine. Panic. Elena ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing loudly. She heard whispers of her name, growing louder and more urgent. She stumbled and fell, the whispers now a cacophony of sinister voices. Beware, your turn will come. Desperate, Elena burst into the headmaster's office, hoping to find answers. The office was dark and cluttered with old papers and books. The headmaster's chair slowly turned to reveal a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. Elena screamed and backed away, tripping over a stack of books. Elena fled the building, her heart pounding. She looked back at the school, which now seemed even more menacing under the moonlight. As Elena ran across the school grounds, she felt a presence chasing her. She reached the gates and looked back one last time. There was a dark shadow peering out from the window. Safe back in her room, Elena tried to calm herself, but the events of the night kept replaying in her mind. She opened her laptop and began writing about the curse, determined to warn others. As she typed, she felt a strange sensation. A shadowy figure lunged towards Elena. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure grabbed her arm, and she was suddenly overwhelmed by a flood of terrifying visions. Students being dragged into darkness, their faces twisted in silent screams, and the entity that started the curse grinning maliciously. Elena saw the student who made the pact, standing before a dark figure with glowing eyes, signing a blood-soaked contract. Elena snapped back to reality, the shadowy figure gone. She was left shivering, a dark mark on her arm where the figure had grabbed her. The screen faded to black, and the only sound was a whisper. Good luck. If you don't leave, you will be next. She didn't know if the curse would follow her, but with such a warning, she decided not to stay another minute. The next day, she left and transferred to a different school. Not long after, the school was abandoned due to rumors, and students gradually left.
Mysterious hitchhiker. Ami didn't really like driving. A few years ago, she had to drive for hours every day to attend her specialized course. One day, on her usual route, the traffic was worse than she expected. She was tired and frustrated, inching her car forward bit by bit, feeling like time was dragging on endlessly. The cause of the traffic jam was a broken-down bus. Ami finally passed it and sighed with relief as the road ahead cleared up. But then, a few miles later, something caught Ami's attention. At a bus stop, there was a pregnant woman with her thumb out, trying to hitch a ride. Ami thought she needed help. Without thinking much, Ami slowed down and stopped. The woman opened the door and got in. The woman gently thanked Ami, explaining that the bus had broken down and she'd be waiting forever if she relied on it. She said she needed a short ride, and Ami agreed. They chatted for a bit, with Ami politely responding, but something didn't feel right. The woman's voice was strange, making Ami feel uneasy. Ami drove for a while in awkward silence. Then suddenly, 2 police cars with blaring sirens sped past them. The woman next to Ami tensed up, acting strangely as if she were hiding something. That's when Ami noticed the woman gripping her purse tightly. Something shiny caught her eye. It looked like metal, maybe a knife. Every instinct told her that something was very wrong. She kept driving, trying to stay calm. She didn't know what to do, but she couldn't let on that she had seen it. That's when she noticed something strange. The woman's hair looked unnatural. Ami glanced over and realized she was wearing a wig. Beneath it, she could see stubble and thick hair on the woman's face and arms. This wasn't a pregnant woman at all. This was someone of an entirely different gender. She was a man. This wasn't just a hitchhiker. This was a dangerous person who had clearly planned this. Ami slowed down and stopped the car by the side of the road, hoping to buy herself a little more time. He immediately asked her why she had stopped the car. She started lying to distract him. She said she was feeling unwell and needed to stop and step outside for a bit. Her hands began trembling as she gripped the door handle. As soon as she stepped out of the car, she left the engine running. Luckily, her car had an anti-theft system, the only thing stopping the car from being driven without her. He got into the driver's seat and tried to drive it away, but suddenly the engine stopped. He angrily got out, still in the guise of a woman. He began shouting, telling her to come back, but she pretended not to hear and kept walking. She heard his frantic footsteps behind her. Ami turned to see him rushing towards her, the wig falling off, revealing the truth that she had predicted. She could only run as fast as she could. A car approached and slowed down when they saw her. Ami waved frantically, begging them to stop. When they did, she pleaded for help, telling them someone was chasing her. The driver didn't say anything, but they saw the panic in her eyes and let her into the car. They drove back to where Amy's car was, but by the time they arrived, he had disappeared. Ami reported the incident to the police. Not long after, they found and arrested the hitchhiker, a dangerous fugitive, wanted for a string of crimes. She could have been his next victim if she hadn't been alert. Abandoned McDonald's. For the past few weeks, I had been planning a vlog to explore and uncover the rumors surrounding an abandoned McDonald's that had been circulating for years, stories of massacres and unsolved crimes. Today, I finally made it here. As I drove towards it, my hands trembled with excitement, though the thought of experiencing it was pretty terrifying. But I believed that if this video went live, it would break all records on my channel. I arrived. It was truly an abandoned store, with peeling paint and dust-caked, grimy windows, giving it a very eerie feel. I took a deep breath and prepared to step through the door to explore. Inside, everything was eerily silent. The floor was dotted with patches of mold. The tables and chairs were arranged neatly, but covered with a thick layer of dust. I scanned my camera over the dining area, trying to capture every detail. The old menu was still there, faded and barely legible, just like the posters on the wall, all rotting from years of abandonment. I made my way towards the kitchen. Familiar machines like the ice cream maker and deep fryers were still there, but none of them were intact. all rusted beyond repair. Behind the counter, there was a large black mold patch on the floor. It sent shivers down my spine, as if someone had lain there for so long that their body had decomposed into the floor. I had heard rumors that the police once found a body here. I moved forward, trying to ignore the growing unease within me. I headed towards the restroom, just as my flashlight began to flicker. Suddenly, I felt something, a figure behind me. Startled, I turned around, only to see a Ronald McDonald statue grinning back at me. It didn't look anything like I remembered from my childhood. I forced a nervous laugh. I told myself it was just a statue, nothing to worry about. I continued, leaving the strange figure behind, heading towards the restroom. As I reached the restroom door, a musty smell hit my nose, but I pushed the door open anyway. I wanted to confirm a rumor that a killer had hidden a body here. I didn't know if it was true. I walked inside. There wasn't anything too unusual, just an old restroom, fairly spacious, covered in spots of stubborn moss. I felt a small sense of relief. I began panning the camera around every corner of the restroom. Maybe this place wasn't haunted like everyone said. In the end, rumors were just rumors. I left the room, but I couldn't shake off a strange feeling like I wasn't the only one here. My eyes darted to the floor, and I noticed dark stains that I hadn't seen before. I moved closer to capture them clearly on camera. Suddenly, I tripped, dropping the camera. As I bent down to pick it up, instinctively, I looked up and saw a horrifying sight right before my eyes. Hanging from the ceiling, there was a body suspended in the air, the red uniform with the unmistakable golden arches. It was a McDonald's employee. Her face was gaunt, her eye sockets empty and black, with long hair and arms swaying loosely from the ceiling. I needed to get out. My hands shook as I scrambled to grab my camera as quickly as possible. I had to leave, and fast. Now I believed the rumors were true. This place was haunted, cursed. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I found a police station. I told them everything, handed over my camera, and waited for them to investigate. When the police searched the restaurant, they found nothing. But what about the footage on my camera? I reviewed all the footage of the restaurant, the kitchen, the restroom, everything was there. But when it got to the part with the Ronald McDonald statue, there was no statue at all. The terrifying scenes I had witnessed, none of it was in the video. I was left speechless, with no explanation. Man in black cloak. The sun shone down on a small village nestled among towering mountains. An old suspension bridge stretched across the rushing St. River, its wooden planks creaking in the wind. His name was Brandon, and he was sitting at the table, surrounded by stacks of books as he prepared for the bar exam. The stress weighed heavily on him, and he decided to take a break in a secluded spot. Stepping outside, the chilly late October air hit him. Brandon walked past a few nearby houses, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot creating a soothing sound. As he approached the suspension bridge, he gazed at the rushing river below. He closed his eyes, taking in the fresh air of nature. Suddenly, he felt the presence of someone nearby. He opened his eyes and saw a man in a black cloak standing in the middle of the bridge, fully shrouded. Brandon's heart raced as he saw the man drawing something on the railing of the bridge. A sense of unease rose within him, and he chose to avoid the man, turning back toward the forest along the riverbank. The overgrown trail ahead was thick with brush. He carefully tread over the uneven ground, trying to shake off the lingering anxiety after his encounter with the man. Emerging from the foliage, he reached the creek's edge. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. A brief sense of peace washed over him, but it was fleeting. In the fading light, Brandon saw flickering flames ahead. Confusion filled him, as he had expected to be alone out here. Curiosity rose despite his unease. Brandon moved closer, the crackling sound of the fire growing louder. As he approached, he saw 3 people in black cloaks standing around a man who looked injured, bound and covered in blood, lying on the ground. He could only hold his breath in fear. The flickering torchlight cast strange shadows, making the scene even more horrifying. They chanted ominously, in a language Brandon couldn't understand. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the terrifying sight. Panic rose within him, and he knew he needed to leave. One of the cloaked figures pulled out a knife, and Brandon's instincts screamed that something was wrong. He couldn't stay here any longer. He had to run. Just as he was about to flee, the man Brandon had seen on the bridge appeared, stepping out of a small boat nearby, his hood falling back to reveal tattoos covering his pale skin. At that moment, the man pointed in Brandon's direction, and in an instant, it was clear he had seen him. The world around him seemed to fade into darkness, and the man's demonic eyes appeared to pierce through his soul. The discomfort Brandon had felt earlier on the bridge turned into pure terror as the man began to move toward him quickly and menacingly. Brandon's instincts kicked in immediately. He forgot about the poor man being held as a sacrifice and started running. He could hear the man's breath behind him as he ran through the brush, branches whipping against his face. The twigs scratched at his arms as he ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Brandon was losing strength, and the distance to safety seemed endless. He finally emerged from the forest and onto the trail. The man and his cloak were still behind him, so he turned left toward the bridge. As there were no houses nearby and no one to call for help, the weight of exhaustion hit him, but there was no time to rest. He turned around and saw the man approaching, his face like a mask of rage. When he reached the middle of the suspension bridge, he stood there in disbelief and filled with fear. He looked at the wooden railing and read the mark that the cloaked man had written less than half an hour ago. It was barely legible, as it had been etched with a blade, but he was certain it read, Brandon McCain, August 7th, 1993, to October 20th, 2021. It was his name, along with his birth date. He realized that perhaps today would be a milestone in his life. And when he noticed the man approaching, holding a dagger, that could be the day he was about to die. The man swung the blade at him, and Brandon only had a few minutes to act. Brandon forgot all the legends, the depth, and the freezing temperatures, the river that could be a monster pulling him under. He didn't care. He lifted his right leg onto the railing, and as the man moved, Brandon dodged the blade that nearly pierced him. As the icy water splashed around him, his blood circulation became erratic. He only had enough time to look up and see the man on the bridge, still watching. But the freezing water dragged him down, and his body began to tremble as unbearable pain engulfed him. Brandon was nearly lost to disorientation, sinking slowly before closing his eyes, perhaps never to open them again. The Blonde Girl. This is a story that happened a long time ago when I visited my local library. I have always been drawn to the lonely silence of old libraries. The air inside was heavy with the smell of old paper and dust, and the walls were lined with towering bookshelves that. I remember that I went there to borrow a few educational books. The internet existed at that time, but you couldn't just Google anything you wanted to know. The more conventional method for me was to go to the library and check out books on the subjects I was interested in. Anyway, I drove to the library, which was only about a 5-minute drive from my house. I walked in just as the library was about to close. I thought I was the only one in the library. As I walked through the aisles, my footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor. The daylight outside was fading, casting long, strange shadows through the narrow windows. The library was quite large, and I headed to the section of books I was looking for. I felt immersed there. The silence was pleasant, only occasionally broken by the rustle of turning pages. I started looking for the best books to borrow. I spent a few minutes browsing and comparing the books. As evening approached, I decided to look at a particularly intriguing book I had found on spirituality, the supernatural, and horror. It was the only one on the shelf, and I picked it up. Some passages of the book talked about a blonde girl who had been brutally murdered, horrifically, by ancient cursed legends. She was like a sacrificial offering. Just as I was about to leave, a chill ran down my spine. I glanced over my shoulder and saw her, a blonde girl standing in the far corner of the library. She was partially obscured by the shadows, the light fading dimly. There was something unsettling about her presence, an eerie silence that seemed to absorb all sound around her. She seemed almost out of place. This woman appeared quite young, with blonde hair, wearing a polka dot headband as if from many decades ago. My heart began to race. The girl didn't move, her gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I hesitated, unsure whether to call out to her or quietly leave. As I watched, the girl took a few small, slow steps forward, revealing a pale, emotionless face. Her eyes were dark voids, empty and soulless. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, paralyzing me with fear. The girl took one step closer, then another, moving silently across the floor. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. She moved closer, her movements deliberate and haunting. When she was just a few meters away, she stopped and tilted her head to one side, as if studying me. Finally, I found the strength to move. I slowly backed away, my eyes never leaving hers. The girl remained still, staring at me with her empty, terrifying gaze. I turned and hurried towards the exit, clutching the book tightly. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of my footsteps echoing through the library. Then, suddenly, whispers grew louder, as if speaking directly into my ear, a mixture of voices seeming to come from everywhere. I looked around frantically but saw no one, and I couldn't determine their source. The library, once a sanctuary of knowledge, now felt like an abandoned house. As I fled, the whispers followed, growing more insistent. Panicking, I turned back, but the door had vanished, replaced by an endless corridor of bookshelves. The whispers were now deafening. I clutched the ancient book to my chest. I could see her clearly. The girl stood just inside the threshold, her black eyes sewn shut. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, as if cursing. Her face was grotesquely distorted, and she was holding a box containing something that looked like two eyes. I reached for the door and flung it open, the cold night air hitting me like a physical blow. As I made my way to the exit, I glanced back one last time. In the corner where the girl had stood, I saw a lock of blonde hair lying on the floor, glinting in the sunlight. The whispers had vanished, but the haunting feeling remained, a reminder that some secrets are better left undiscovered. I never spoke of what I saw that night. Sometimes, as I lay in bed, I was reminded not to mention the girl. She would scream, tears that couldn't fall because she had no eyes. If I spoke, she would be in danger for being exposed. Perhaps we had made a spiritual connection. She looked so pitiful. I didn't know what else to do but go to the church and pray for her. 2 months later, the dreams began to fade, and I rarely saw her in my sleep anymore. Perhaps it was a good thing for her. The Stranger's Chase at Dunkin' Donut. It was just another regular shift at Dunkin', where I work part-time. The night shift is my usual shift, and tonight was no different. We usually close at 9 p.m., and I've grown used to the quiet that settles over the store as night falls. We had to clean up everything, and my coworker hadn't shown up yet. But that wasn't unusual. I was fine handling the store by myself. The inside of this Dunkin' was larger than most, with a few booths and tables scattered around. I had spent the last few hours in silence. No one had come in, and the last customer had left by 8:30 p.m. With only a few minutes left until closing, I walked around as usual, wiping down tables and making sure everything was tidy. As I passed by, heading back to the counter to clean up, something made my heart race. I hadn't noticed him before, but there was a man crouched down, almost hiding in the corner, completely out of sight from behind the counter. Everything seemed to freeze as his eyes locked with mine the moment I saw him. For a second, neither of us moved. The man slowly stood up. He was of average height, skinny, with messy hair and disheveled clothes. I asked him if he was okay, my voice trembling as I tried to stay calm. He didn't respond right away, mumbling that he was fine. I reminded him that we were closing and he needed to leave. He nodded and started walking toward the door. For a moment, I thought everything was fine, but then, without warning, he turned around and sprinted toward the counter with a crazed look on his face. Everything happened so fast. He didn't head for the door. He ran straight behind the counter, his eyes locked on the cash register. I began to realize what was happening. Without hesitation, I made for the exit, my mind racing. I didn't care about the cash register. I just needed to get out. Guys like him are dangerous, and they usually carry weapons. I had to be smart about this. But before I could reach the door, his voice rang out, loud and threatening. He shouted, his voice filled with anger. Stop. Froze for a second, but instinct kicked in, and I kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed the door open and ran out, without looking back. I thought he would be inside to rob the store, but I was wrong. He chased after me, running through the parking lot, and fear gripped me like never before. I looked around the area, but most of the stores were dark and closed. I spotted a gas station in the distance, its lights flickering like a beacon of hope. I ran faster, my breath quickening, and he was still behind me. The distance between us seemed to shrink. I burst into the gas station, my chest heaving with each breath. It was the closest place still open. As I ran inside, I shouted for someone to call the police. My voice was panicked and full of fear, echoing through the empty space. The clerk behind the counter and a lone customer turned to look at me. Startled, I ran past them, heading straight for the back of the store. A small restroom sign caught my attention. My fingers fumbled with the lock as I rushed inside. The flickering light in the small restroom, combined with the smell of bleach, heightened my tension. I was shaking uncontrollably. Leaning against the door, I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I reached into my pocket, my hands trembling as I pulled out my phone and called the police. The dispatcher reassured me that officers were on their way, but the minutes felt like hours as I waited. I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, listening for any sign of him. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. Was he following me? Was he out there, lurking? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong and that whatever awaited me outside wasn't over. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly unlocked the bathroom door and peeked outside. The gas station was eerily silent. The cashier was no longer behind the counter, and the customer had disappeared. I cautiously stepped out further. The dim lights cast long shadows over the shelves. I walked carefully, my own footsteps suddenly too loud. My eyes darted to the door, but there was no sign of the man outside. For a brief moment, a wave of relief washed over me. Then I saw him. Through the glass window, his face appeared pale and terrifying. His wild eyes pressed against the glass like something from a nightmare. His eyes locked onto mine, a twisted smile spreading across his face. He smiled grotesquely, almost stretching from ear to ear. Then he breathed onto the glass, writing the word "run." It felt like a challenge, daring me to try escaping. He slowly dragged his finger down the window, the screeching sound sending chills down my spine. He was waiting like a predator, knowing that eventually I would have to come out. Panic surged within me again. I rushed toward the back exit, hoping it would lead to some way out. As I pushed the door open, I found myself outside again, this time in the alley behind the station. My breath fogged the cold air as I frantically looked around for somewhere to hide. The alley was narrow, with tall brick walls on either side, dark and unwelcoming. A few trash bins lined the path, but it was mostly empty. I had to make a choice. The only way out was forward or back to the gas station, where he might be waiting for me. I didn't have time to think. I started running, my body moving on instinct. As I ran, I glanced over my shoulder, nothing behind me. Still, fear gripped me tightly. This alley too dark, too unknown, leaving me vulnerable to whatever could come. I turned the corner and was met with a dead end. My heart sank as I saw the towering chain link fence blocking my way. I could hear my own breath, ragged and loud, and feel the cold sweat on my skin. Maybe there was no way out. Footsteps echoed behind me, slow. Maybe he was coming closer. My body froze in place as the sound grew louder, the rhythm unsettling in its calmness. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. My back pressed against the cold brick wall as I realized I had no other choice but to face him. He appeared at the end of the alley, his eyes locked onto mine with that twisted smile. His steps slowed as he moved into the faint light, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the ground. In his hand, he held an iron rod. My heart was pounding in my chest. My legs were shaking. Then he spoke. "You can't run forever." His voice was low, mocking, and dragged the iron bar across the road with screeching sounds. My mind seemed to be spinning. I scanned the alley, desperately searching for anything that could help me. Without thinking, I grabbed a broken brick lying near the trash cans. I knew it wasn't enough to stop him, but I had no other choice. It was all I had. He stopped just inches from me, smirking. "You really think that's going to stop me?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. As he took one more step toward me, I swung the brick with all my strength. In the moment, he was too focused on taunting me. Turning away smugly, I threw the brick, and it hit him square in the head. For a second, everything froze. He staggered back, the smile vanishing from his face as blood trickled down his forehead. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I seized the moment and ran. I didn't look back. All I could think about was getting as far away as possible. The sound of sirens tore through the night air in the distance. The police were coming, but I didn't stop running. Right then, the screech of tires cut through the air as police cars appeared. 3 patrol cars pulled into the gas station, red and blue lights flashing furiously. I could see the officers jump out, guns drawn, moving with urgency. I tried to shout, trembling as I pointed toward the alley. "He's over there." The officer nodded quickly and signaled to the others. They disappeared into the alley. their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they shouted commands. The man appeared at the mouth of the alley, running toward the parking lot. But this time he wasn't alone. The police were right behind him. His wild eyes darted in every direction as he desperately searched for a way out, but he was surrounded. The police quickly tackled him to the ground. The man struggled violently, his voice twisted with rage, sending chills down my spine. But now, I was truly safe. The flashing lights of the police cars began to fade as I sat on the cold sidewalk, trying to piece together everything that had happened. It was over, but the horror still lingered. Intruder on Halloween. The clock ticks softly, its sound nearly drowned out by the eerie music playing on the TV. Colorful costumes and decorations adorn the walls, remnants of the Halloween festival. Tonight, like every year, I was going trick or treating with my best friend, Casey. Excitement filled the air as we stuffed our bags with candy, the weight of our haul increasing after each house we visited. The streets were filled with laughter and the sound of children running from house to house. As we walked, we noticed a man standing near a lamppost. He wore a mask and held a flickering lantern. His eyes seemed to follow us as we passed by, sending a chill down my spine. I glanced at Casey, and we quickened our pace. We continued our journey, laughing and screaming as we collected treats, but occasionally, I caught a glimpse of the masked man lingering just out of reach. It felt like he was watching us. At one house, while we were busy stuffing our bags, I turned around and saw him standing on the street, intently watching us. I yelled at Casey to get away, that we needed to run fast from there. We hurried to the front door of the house we were at and knocked frantically. The homeowner opened the door. We explained that there was a scary man outside. The couple looked worried and ushered us inside for safety as the masked man moved further down the street. After a few minutes, we saw the masked man had left, and we thought we could leave the house now. Just as we thought we had escaped, I spotted him hiding behind a tree, waving at us. Panic flooded me. He only backed away when an adult threatened to call the police. After walking a few more blocks, we crossed a small wooden bridge over the river. The night air was fresh and cool, but a sense of unease washed over me as a black Jeep stopped on the other side. The driver leaned out the window. A spooky man wearing a pumpkin mask called out to us in a gravelly voice. "We need directions," he shouted. I felt a bit suspicious and distrustful of this man, so I declined and we kept moving. The Jeep couldn't cross the bridge, so we had to drive away. But just when we thought we were safe, a long time later, an SUV screeched around the corner of the bridge and stopped right in front of us. The window rolled down, revealing a man who was probably someone else, but he was also wearing the same mask. Then he said, "Get in the car, and they have free bags of candy," the man shouted, his voice filled with manipulation. My heart raced as I glanced at Casey. We turned back to running when I heard the car roar again. The man started to get out of the car. We just ran as fast as we could to the house because we were almost home. We finally arrived home. My mother left for work, so it was just the two of us at home. Tonight, Casey slept at my house to stay safe. Every second passed as I looked out the window uneasily at that man in the pumpkin mask. The memory of the Jeep, everything was still in my mind. Mine. The streets were pitch black, darkness stretching over the sidewalk. I held my phone, staring at the screen, hoping to distract myself from the rising anxiety within. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. A message from Casey. What if they come back? I glanced at her, but she was still peacefully asleep, unaware of the tension suffocating the room. I cautiously approached the window and peered through the curtains. My heart skipped a beat. The black Jeep was parked outside my house. I whispered urgently, shaking Casey awake. Casey's eyes flew open in fear. We both sat up, listening intently. The engine roared, and I could see a shadow moving inside the Jeep. My pulse quickened, and I knew we had to act and come up with a plan. I whispered, "If he comes in, we have to trap that man." We gathered supplies, a heavy chair, some rope from my dad's toolbox, and my phone, so I could call for help if needed. We figured we could block the door if he came in, trapping him inside. Casey nodded, and we hurriedly propped the chair against the door, tying it tightly with the rope. We were ready and positioned behind the chair, preparing for anything that might happen. Through the glass, I saw the masked man standing by the front door, his shadow ominously stretching. My heart raced as he knocked, the sound echoing like thunder in the silence of the night. Suddenly, I saw the man step back, turn around and walk towards the Jeep. I watched in horror as another figure stepped out of the car, both wearing masks and dark clothes. My mind is racing now. There are two people, I whispered. Fumbling for my phone, "Casey, we need to call the police." Fear gripped me, knowing our trap might only buy us a little time to escape safely. But before I could dial, I heard footsteps approaching the house. The doorknob rattled, and my heart raced. The masked man yelled something indistinct, and I felt panic rise. "They're trying to get in," I said, gripping Casey's arm tightly. I heard them banging on the door, trying to break it down. The chair held for now, but I knew it wouldn't last long. "Call the police," I shouted, but Casey was frozen in fear, her eyes wide. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I whispered, "We need to run, and when they break in, Casey and I will head for the back door." With a loud crash, the chair toppled over. The door swung open. The masked man charged into the living room, followed by another figure. I slowly crawled toward the door, then grabbed Casey's hand, and we ran toward the back door, quietly escaping the intruders. We bolted out into the backyard and ran toward the fence. Behind us, I heard the men shouting. I shouted for Casey to climb over the fence. I thought we still had hope and needed to seize this chance to try to get over. As things grew urgent, I started to climb up, but unfortunately for me, one of them came outside and managed to grab and pull my leg. I flailed and kicked at his face, but it didn't seem to matter. It didn't faze him at all. I fell painfully to the ground. I looked in agony as Casey cried in fear by the fence on the other side. I screamed for her to run. I would follow, but she seemed too scared, worried for my safety. I lay in pain, watching him grin grotesquely. He taunted me, saying trick or treat, and waved at Casey playfully, enjoying our fear. I reassured myself that I needed to escape and survive. I slowly, secretly grabbed the ice and stood up to answer his question as if I was pretending to play with him. I took candy out of my pocket and said I wouldn't run away. I asked if he wanted a piece of candy. He seemed surprised and didn't notice as I threw the rock at his face. He fell, screaming in pain, and his friend came out from the house, witnessing it. He also yelled in anger. I didn't think much, trying to use the remaining strength to climb over the fence to escape. Just as we were about to escape, I heard the distant sound of a siren. I felt relieved. The police were coming. I headed toward the front yard to meet them. When we reached the front yard, the flashing lights of the police car lit up the street. The officers ran toward us, and I pointed at the men trying to flee back to the Jeep. "They're over there," I shouted, and the police sprang into action, chasing after them. Within minutes, the police had apprehended the masked men. Back inside the house, my mom rushed in, just returning home. She pulled us into a tight hug, relief evident on her face. Casey and I exchanged glances. We were finally safe. My mom made us a cup of hot cocoa, and as I took a sip, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly everything had turned from a night of fear to a sense of safety. I said, glancing at Casey, maybe Halloween isn't so bad after all.